Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. And we are going to get into it on the question of epistemology. Now, what is epistemology? As soon as you start delving into the online discourse over the truth claims of the Mormon church or any other religious church, or even some of the secular worldviews that are out there and the philosophies and postmodernism and all these different things, the word epistemology is going to come up and it'll be thrown at you by some big brain person, and they're going to count on the fact that you haven't really looked into it, and then it'll make them seem smart and you'll seem dumb, and you won't know what to make with it. But today we're going to kind of approach the question of epistemology from the perspective of somebody who is someone who's both wrestled with the philosophical secular side of things and is able to maintain a faithful perspective in the LDS or Mormon or Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints tradition. And so what I want to do is introduce my guests today, because both of them are people who have engaged with this, both with critics and in the domain of faithful defenders of the church. And so these aren't people that have been walled off to some single echo chamber and really haven't encountered it. And my goal in today's conversation is to have an understanding of the epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, how you can separate justified forms of belief in claims versus those which are purely opinion or do not have the substance in order for them to be sufficiently justified. It's kind of that critical question of sifting the wheats and the tares of truth claims that speaks to the heart of epistemology. And so two characters who have kind of stood out in the online discourse. If you've been watching Bill Rill's channel, you'll seen Jacob Hansen, who has gone through a series of discussions with him wrestling with some of these tough issues. And Dan Ellsworth is our other interlocutor who has shown up on Quick Media and a couple of other places, in addition to being involved in Fair Mormon, I believe, in the past. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves somewhat. Jacob, we have you first. Hey, can you give us a kind of just a brief snapshot of what brings you to this online domain where you're engaging with people in both the faithful and former paradigms?
Yeah, so I think the main thing is I'm from a family of 8 children, and I'm the only one who's left in the church out of my 8 siblings. So that's kind of, I think, what spawned my interest in all of the philosophical and religious sort of conversations. That journey was very much a journey where I had to explore a lot more than just being a Latter-day Saint. It was very much more, I had to explore atheism and explore kind of the philosophical side, I say first. And eventually I created a website and a blog, and then it morphed into a YouTube channel where I talk about these kinds of things. And so because of that, and then through various online forums and other interactions, we got connected. And I guess that's kind of how we came to be in this space.
Yeah, and if you want to dive in a little bit more to Jacob's background, we've done like an in-depth, intensive, is it culty interview where he looked at the things that people usually call the bite model of cult dynamics and his own experience in his assessment of those in the church. You can find that on the channel there. And to make sure we can move along here, I will introduce Dan. Dan Ellsworth, can you give us just a brief snapshot as to what has brought you to the online space, interfacing over these questions?
Yeah, years ago, I went through what I used to call a faith crisis that I now call a midlife crisis. But it just arriving at a point where I came to a point where I just knew that the way I had approached my faith up until that point was not going to work going forward. And I had to reevaluate a lot of, actually really interrogate, why do I believe the things that I believe? And ask these questions that are germane to epistemology. Is a particular belief that I hold warranted? Is it justified? Is it? And I'm not a philosopher necessarily. I mean, everybody's technically a philosopher, but I took 3 philosophy courses in college. And so during that period, I just kind of went back and said, okay, I remember some things from philosophy. I remember this thing called epistemology, and I'm going to dive in and really explore it and see how it can apply to this. And so I do presentations on it, and it's been really helpful for me and a lot of other people.
Okay, excellent. So that's a great introduction to the theme of today's discussion, which is I want to give you guys a chance because I know each of you have your differences on finer details, but both of you seem to engage online with a fairly consistent form of epistemology in terms of how you've been able to reconcile aspects of the church with a systematic thought process for separating truth from falsehood. And let you lay that out, and let's try to do it without actually referencing any religious claim at all, just a generic system for establishing truth. And then we're going to take that system that you lay out and then apply it to different, both religious and non-religious aspects to see how it interfaces with different truth claims. And what I'm hoping for at the end of this is to have people in my audience kind of have a better understanding of a form of epistemology that is able to give honor to kind of both dimensions in terms of the truth claim of a faith religion, as well as being able to sort out false claims. Because even if you start with the position of we're going to believe claims that are based on faith that are in the religious domain, you still have to confront the fact that there are people who are charlatans who do prey upon people, and their predatory endeavors are facilitated by claims that you could apply an epistemological lens to try to figure out, oh, wait a second, what David Koresh is claiming actually doesn't actually hold up to scrutiny. So with that being said, if you guys are good, what I'd like to do is to give you a chance to just lay out your case to the believer and the non-believer for a form of epistemology that can do just that.
All right, Dan, do you mind if I kind of get started here? And to start, like you're saying, without going into a specific religious claim, epistemology is like, it's the ground floor. It's the first conversation you need to have as a truth seeker, because you have to figure out, how would you even determine what is true at all, right? Because so this isn't a Mormon thing. This is everybody. Like, if you want to go out and look for truth in the world, you have to have some sort of an epistemological system that you're utilizing to do that. And what I did is I basically went down to ask that very fundamental philosophical question of, well, how do I know anything? And what I noticed is that people, and I began to ask, I began to notice that people will use different things to justify why something is true. And we tend to accept these things as valid. And it was interesting, and not to go into something that is particularly religious, but Truman Madsen, in a 1994 address to BYU called On How We Know, he addressed this idea. He said, brothers and sisters, over a period of 40 years, I have worked in the area of how one knows, and I can report in a comparative mood that there are really only 5 main modes that have been appealed to in all the traditions, philosophical or religious. Okay, so he's saying that in all of them, not just within our tradition. And he says they are an appeal to reason, an appeal to sense experience, to pragmatic trial and error, to authority, the word experts, as he says, and finally to something a bit more ambiguous called intuition. And so what he's presenting, what's funny is I actually didn't realize that this talk had even been given when I kind of came up with this. And when I read this, I about fell out of my chair, because I was like, oh my gosh, he's talking about the exact same things. He even uses almost the same 5 that I call my 5 witnesses to truth, or things that give you confidence that something is true. And so the analogy that I use, and Dan has a very, very similar thing. We talk about the same stuff, though we use some different language. Is the basic idea is I say you're like a judge sitting, and you have these witnesses that come to you. It could be the witness of your eyeballs. Like, I'm looking at this screen right now, and my eyeballs are telling me as the judge, like, hey, this is what's going on in the external world, right? So that's one witness. But then there are other things that witness to the reality of things. Authority being another one that's very, very common, extraordinarily common, by the way. Like you don't actually know, Jonathan, what the speed of light is, but you believe the speed of light is a certain thing because of what authorities tell you, even though you yourself, and there's all sorts of things, like what is the composition of the soil on Mars? Like you didn't have sensory experience, that you trust authorities to tell you those sorts of things. So authority is another one. You can say that something is true because it works, right? Like we might ask, well, why do we trust reason? Here we go. Outcomes would be what works, right? It functions, therefore we will use that as a justification to say that something works. If I were to ask you, why is it wrong to harm an innocent baby? Really, intuition would have to play into that to some degree. And so let me see, I got reason, authority, you have sense data, your eyes, outcomes, and then intuition. And so the whole idea is that these things come together. And if I'm the judge and all 5 of these say the same thing, well, then I have a higher level of confidence in believing that it's true. Whereas if there are conflicting witnesses, just like a judge has conflicting witnesses, I become less confident that something is true. So anyway, that's my kind of quick summation. Dan, anything you want to add?
No, I again, we use kind of different language sometimes when we talk about it. And the way I try to help people visualize it is, look at these things on a Venn diagram and see where they converge, and where you have the most convergence, that just shows you, like Jacob said, a higher degree of confidence. One of the problems with epistemology often, that people bring to epistemology is just kind of a binary understanding of knowledge. You either know something through, absolute convergence of all of these factors, or you don't know it at all. And so when you look at this, you can actually look at these 5 witnesses, for example, and say, okay, there are a lot of things that I do feel confident that I know, where 1 or 2 of the witnesses doesn't really have a seat at the table, isn't relevant, but they don't need to be, right? Or maybe they're not all 100% in agreement, but I still have a pretty high level of confidence for one reason or another. So those are my thoughts.
And so as I'm listening to you guys lay out this landscape, I read a book called The Parasitic Mind by God Sad. And one of the concepts he tried to make out was something that he called a nomological network, where you have different specialties in different academic domains that, using different means of coming to truth, all point to the same thing. And it's at those intersections where you may have linguistics or astronomy or several different disciplines that all converge on something, then that increases this confidence that what one believes is true. That's one thing that I think shows that other people are thinking along the same lines. Another thing that comes to mind, Dan, with what you're talking about in terms of there are some claims for which an objective scientific approach to what is true isn't really relevant, because they're claims that are more about human things, just in terms of, does your wife love you or something like that, where it's hard to find in a testable blind peer-reviewed way of assessing that or something like that. So I think it's important to separate scientific claims perhaps from claims that fall outside of that domain. And certainly the trouble with some religious claims is that it kind of blurs the boundary between those two things. I guess if we were to then say, okay, well, using this framework that you have, how does somebody then approach the question of whether a claim is true? And Jacob, you brought out 5 different things, and I think reason and sense data would tend to be the primary thing for what you start with, and then look at authority and then intuition and perhaps finally outcomes. But how would you rank those in terms, or do you approach it from a different way in terms of passing through one gate, then the next, then the next?
So I actually want to clarify something. Bill Reel had really gotten into this with me kind of even after our discussion, and it's this idea of reason. I want to say I'm talking about reason in terms of in accordance with the laws of logic. That's what I mean. So you could even replace reason with logic, and there's some semantic distinctions there that but I want people to just know when I say reason, I'm talking about in accordance with the laws of logic. Now, as far as the question, first thing I look at is what is the question about, right? If we're talking about the boiling point of water, well, then I can utilize certain sense data and mixed with logic to come up with what the actual boiling point of water is. So I will bring certain witnesses to bear on certain questions depending on the nature of the questions themselves. Now, another factor I want to kind of put out there from the start, in my view, and just quick side note for everybody, Dan and I are both Latter-day Saints, but we don't necessarily agree on all these things. So if there's disagreement between me and Dan, just know, and I think all three of us, we're all human beings here. We all, Jonathan, you included, we all have to come to the table and say, okay, we all got to have a model for how we figure out what's true. The question is just which model seems to be the best fit. But real quick, so back to how these models apply to actually looking for particular truth. Again, it depends on the truth claim, the type of claim that it is. And then the other thing is reason or logic is, in my mind, is only as good as the inputs that you give it. Okay. So something can be totally logical, but wrong, right? You can be have a logically valid argument that is not sound, right? Because one of the premises aren't true. And so this is where you get, but what makes it true is the actual inputs, the data itself. You may just have bad data. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so I just want to make that differentiator, is that in all of these, logic will sort of apply. It's sort of the computational machine that the inputs have to be fed into. And if something just is illogical, logically invalid, if I say that, Jonathan, you are a married bachelor, that isn't like, that claim doesn't make any sense. It doesn't even cross the bar of consideration at all. However, if I do make something that is a logically valid statement, I then have to see what are these premises that I'm bringing to the table? Are they actually true? And that will depend very much on the data inputs that are coming into that. And so
that's an opportunity.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think when you encounter something like that, it's an opportunity for you to step back and say, okay, well, let's check our premises. So now, rather than applying this lens of epistemology to the question at hand, we have to back up and apply it then to the premises that we were using for that. Yes. And there is a danger in doing that you're going to go so far back in your premises that you're going to hit the Descartes, the radical skepticism thing of, since we can never know anything 100% for true, then we have to allow a radical skepticism to infuse all of our beliefs, and we can never rely on anything. And that's an extreme that it's kind of like physicists saying, well, since matter is 99.9% vacuum and we exist, atomic particles exist as a cloud of possibilities, then matter should not apply against each other. Like, no, there's a point at which, despite those extreme perceptions or descriptions, something is fitting together, something becomes solid. And I guess that's the outer bound of it in that direction. So let's take this then and maybe apply it to a real world situation. So we've encountered certainly lots of non-religious claims about truth for which somebody might wonder. And there's a human psychological dynamic to this. There's a few documentaries out there about flat earthers. And I've watched one of them. I incorporated it into another video, but you'll hear the story of people who, their grandpa started watching some videos and then kind of got sucked into an echo chamber where it's just a bunch of people playing on doubt, expanding doubt, and then going down systems of belief that gradually silence any dissenting voices on what outsiders would say is a conspiracy theory, and it leads them at the other end of that process to wildly radical claims. And one of those would be the flat Earth thing. And so if I can share just a little picture to give us something to talk over, I think. So, this is one paradigm where people are claiming that actually we've all been hoodwinked. It's been a worldwide conspiracy to lay out a falsehood that the Earth is a spherical-ish kind of shape, that we exist in a solar system, and actually the Earth is flat, and there's a holographic dome over it. And there's this great video clip of Uchtdorf in one of his talks actually, making this argument, or saying, people will believe anything. Like, some people believe the Earth is flat and that the moon is holographic, and he's like, it kind of looks like it, But okay, so apply your epistemology to claims like this. How would you do it?
So, you mind if I jump in on this one?
Yeah,
Jacob?
no, you go first, Dan.
Okay, so when the flat Earth, I don't know if you want to call it a conspiracy theory, it became an issue. There were a lot of news reports about Google and YouTube content moderators who were actually sifting through people's uploads into YouTube, and some of them were coming across these flat earther videos and being indoctrinated into flat earth ideology. These were content moderators who were getting sucked into the rabbit hole, and it became a thing. All of a sudden it was like, whoa, how do we stop that from happening? Right. But the basic epistemology at work in that kind of a situation is what we call the Gish Gallop. And it's where somebody is overwhelmed with things that they cannot answer. And they don't have to be high quality claims or allegations or whatever. They just can't answer them. And, these videos that people were uploading, you would have content moderators who don't really know how to think through and evaluate these things and step back and have some grasp of epistemology, and they'd be overwhelmed. So conspiracy theories tend to do that. They overwhelm people, and people get sucked in, and all of a sudden they're looking around and saying, oh, all the rest of you are in on it too. Right. And
so I want to pause right there,
okay,
because this concept of a Gish Gallop, I think, is an important one. And it came up in Jacob and Bill Reel's conversation. So if you put yourself in the place of one of these flat earth activists, and they're trying to talk to perhaps a scientist, and then they bring up all of the different, isolated points that they bring up to try to disprove the position of the scientist, it's going to feel like a Gish Gallop, because like you can shovel crap and it just takes like a 10-second, point of crap is going to take like an hour to untangle and to work through from that perspective. Now, you could also flip it on the other side around, and that is, you could have a flat earther talk with a scientist who has a whole bunch of data points saying, listen, your claim about the flat earth is incorrect, and we have gravitational, we have light, we have all these different points of data that show you how it's done. And then the flat earther could say, well, you're Gish Galloping me, and that's a logical fallacy, and so therefore no one should listen to you.
correct.
How do you sort between those two different perspectives? Because it seems like that a Gish Gallop per se does not necessarily invalidate a perspective.
So this is where we get into an interesting concept, and I'll try to be quick in telling this story. A few years ago, I came across a friend who had gotten into several big conspiracy theories. An absolutely brilliant human being, and he had spent way too much time online researching conspiracy theories and got into them. And he and I had lunch, and I was just, I got shoveled on. It was the dump truck of facts, information, data poured on me. And a lot of these were government conspiracy theories. And I was like, wow, okay, so I've spent most of my career consulting in government. Well, one of these conspiracy theories has to do with the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security back in like 2003, 2004. And I dove into this conspiracy theory, and it was phenomenal. Like, factual information about actual things that took place in the agency, people involved, time frames, documentation, all of this. And it was it was incredibly sophisticated. But the problem is, I was there. That's where I worked in that time frame. At the Department of Homeland Security. I was in the belly of the beast. So I looked at all this stuff and I said, oh my gosh, you guys have these legitimate data points, and you've constructed a wholly, alternative history out of them. But I was there. I saw.
Dan was in on it, you guys. Dan was in on it.
Yeah.
So, but
even now he's a psyop.
but that's the thing, Jacob. If I were to go to my friend and say, hey, I was there, he would say that. He would say, you were brainwashed when you were there. And that's why you can't see all of what I see. And I'd be like, okay, I can't get through to you. Right. So this is where that issue of sense data comes forward. Like, okay, here are all these other kinds of data and allegations and things. But if I personally witnessed conversations and was involved in meetings and sat in the rooms where these things were going on, yeah, I'm sorry, my personal observation is going to trump any other seat at the table, right? So when we get into conspiracy theories, that's why you do have to. And the other thing is, looking at my friend, I just had to ask this question, like, what would motivate somebody? Because a lot of our powers of reasoning are put forward and exercised in service of non-rational things that are going on within us. Well, people who get into conspiracy theories are oftentimes people who have been disappointed in life in a number of ways, and they want their disappointments and frustrations with the world to have a big explanation. It's not my fault. There's these powers at work in the world that are controlling everything, right? And so
it sounds like you're saying that there's a really important human psychological element,
yes,
in addition to the data that they have, that
right,
makes holding on to that belief be very important, because it constitutes a part of their identity, a part of their sense of meaning and purpose. And when you watch this documentary, when they talk to the the figureheads of the flat earthers, you totally get the sense that these people, they found a community, they found a purpose, they found
yes,
a way to feel like they are fighting the good fight. And it has so clouded their judgment that and there's this brilliant moment in the documentary where they say, okay, the thing that would prove that this was not, if we got this really expensive compass and then we timed the tilt of it over 15 minutes, if the earth was round, it would move like 15 degrees. It was like some gyroscope or something. But if the earth was flat, it wouldn't move at all. So then they do the test and it moves 15 degrees. It does exactly what would be predicted if the earth was round.
yeah.
But because of the need to believe, they say, okay, no, there must be something interfacing with it. So we're going to put it in a vacuum Gauss chamber that is shielded from the electromagnetic radiation.
Yep.
And that's the thing they're going to do in the future to try to prove it. But it just shows that regardless of claims of truth, there's this human psychological component of it, that if you're trying to engage with someone like that, you may have to just confront the reality that logic and rationality are not really going to be effective.
Right.
What do you make of that, Jacob?
So I wanted to actually go to what you had said. First of all, 2 points. First, the Gish Gallop thing, and then next I want to talk about the flat earth specifically and how I apply the epistemology to it. So the first thing is the Gish Gallop. It is not just because somebody presents a whole bunch of information doesn't necessarily mean it's a Gish Gallop. A Gish Gallop is generally in a live conversation setting where you, in that particular setting, have to respond to a lot of different points. Like you said, you dump something on the table and it'll take you an hour to dismantle that thing, but it only took them 2 seconds to drop it on the table. So it's more a thing of live conversation than it is of actual, just like, hey, I'm presenting a bunch of information. But to that, the whole idea is to get as much data as you can. Anytime someone is just simply ignoring data, that's a problem. That's them ignoring relevant data points. I oftentimes put things on scales. I like to use a scale analogy rather than a shelf analogy. You have on one side of the scale the reason to believe something, and then you have on the other side of the scale reasons to disbelieve. Now, the reality is in any disputed, like genuinely disputed topic, a person will have stuff on both sides of the scale, right? Like, frankly, if you were to talk about the fake moon landing, someone came who really knew their stuff, they could probably put stuff on the side of the scale that I couldn't get off the scale, right? Like it would legit be there. And then you'd be like, look, you're ignoring it. And if I tried to justify it, they might go, wood tools. But it's like, what I'm saying is no, we can leave that on the scale, but we have to take into account the other data here. There's data on the other side of the scale. So that way we see all of the data, right? And I may try and either, let's say you put something on the reason to doubt scale, right? Like Bill Reel, he's talking about elder oaks and electroshock therapy. All right. And that means that he's not trustworthy. And therefore it's like, okay, fine. And we can have a whole conversation about that, about how big of a deal is that? Like, did you just drop a grain of sand onto the scale, or did you just drop like a boulder onto the scale, right? Like, how big of a deal is it? And these are all conversations that you can have. But at the end of the day, you have to see all of the data and then properly size up the relevance of that data to see which side of the scale holds more weight. Anytime someone is just focusing on one side of the scale, there's a problem. Now, this is what happens, though, is that people who believe, what do? They want to point only to the side of the scale with all the beliefs. And the people who disbelieve a thing want to point to all the reasons to disbelieve. And that's just the nature of the debate. A smart, wise person looks at both sides and tries to analyze it as best they can. Okay. Now, flat Earth.
Well, when you bring that up, because I think that's a really good, opening to talk about the nature of how some types of data point may have much more significant implications for a truth claim. And the story that's usually brought up is the white swan, black swan thing, where there's this belief that there's only white swans. And so that belief is pretty strongly held until you discover black swans. And the data point of I see a black swan is way more significant to the claim of all swans are white, then you can never go back from that data. And so another analogous thing would be like to date something at a particular point in time, but then to find something that was undeniably anachronistic. So the classic story is, some story about Abraham Lincoln, but then a VHS tape shows up in the narrative of that story, which is claimed to have been written 100 years before VHS was ever conceived of. So certain types of data, even though it, the number of words perhaps that it might take to express it, it carries a huge weight in terms of the scale. And some points of data will carry a weight that is so huge that it actually completely invalidates or falsifies a truth claim.
Yes.
And so that concept of falsification, where there can be a data point where you can have a bunch of consistent things that match with your sense, with your logic and your reason up until you encounter that data point. And that data point then invalidates everything because it gives you a different understanding of maybe your premises or of the nature of what's going on. The classic experiment of this is on YouTube, where someone's asking someone to guess a rule and they start guessing numbers, and then the person interviewing them will say true or false based on what the number is. And people will develop, okay, I think the number is like every odd number or something. And so they'll keep testing it with adding every other odd number, and the rules will be true. And they'll get a bunch of positive evidence that the rule that they've thought of is the right rule. But then they say the rule, and he's like, that's not actually the rule. And the only way they could actually learn what the rule was to try to falsify it, to try to disprove their hypothesis. And if an attempt to disprove the hypothesis worked, then it would say, okay, this hypothesis, we have a greater confidence that it's wrong. But if it didn't work, it would say, okay, we were wrong. And the rule was actually is just any number higher than the number before it.
And I think that is why you need to have both. If you're only looking for disconfirming evidence, you'll find it. If you're only looking for evidence that confirms your hypothesis, you'll find it. And so that
statement there, if you're only looking for,
go ahead.
That statement, if you're only looking for disconfirming evidence, that you'll find it. I guess so. Let's say that the claim was there are purple swans.
Let me use this example just real quick. In a court of law, you have the prosecution and the defense. And if any of you guys have ever watched the true crime shows, you watch where they make the case for the prosecution, and you're going into that commercial break just like, the guy totally did it. The guy totally did it. And then you hear the defense's case, and you're like, oh no, like maybe he didn't do it. And so in any, again, we have to recognize that in any honestly disputed contention, the reason it's disputed is because if it's broadly contested, right, let's say, it is because there are reasons to doubt and there are reasons to believe a given hypothesis. One of the dangers, I think, in that we end up in this deconstructionism is when all we do is look for things to doubt and to disbelieve. And so what happens is that you end up deconstructing everything. And I mean, I mean, everything, even things that are true. Dan Ellsworth, I know you have your meme you like to share sometimes of that kind of last at this. We can deconstruct all sorts of things, but eventually you deconstruct things that are true if what you're doing is just looking for the disconfirming evidence and not looking for the positive evidence.
Okay, well, that brings a good question, because you mentioned that it can't be just that one of your witnesses has some data point that seems to be overcome, insurmountable, because there are other witnesses that may allow you to perhaps not focus so much on that insurmountable thing. And so I guess this brings up, so I mentioned, you said that if you're only looking for disconfirming evidence, you're going to find it. So I suppose if somebody said, well, there are purple swans or something like that, and then somebody said, okay, well, I'm going to look for a purple swan, but there are no purple swans. And they never find it, though. So that, I guess,
then you'd be
the statement that if you only look for
then you'd be an Englishman looking for a black swan in London and England and going your whole life believing there's no such thing as black swans because you looked everywhere for disconfirming evidence but never found it, and therefore.
Yes. So I think the lesson we learned from that is that saying anything with 100% certainty closes you off to the possibility that you might be mistaken, that new data could be discovered.
Agreed.
And so I think making these truth claims, or if you get to the point of 100% certainty, then you kind of find yourself in the flat earther thing, where they are so certain that they will either dismiss or even appeal to ignorance. They're just like, well, we don't know why it was 15 degrees, but it's some other thing that we'll learn eventually. And so you kind of, they allow themselves to stay in that mistaken perspective because they don't ever respect any of the data that shows it otherwise, because they're 100% confident. So you have to leave some room for the possibility that you might be wrong.
Yes.
How does that make sense? Because does one of these witnesses get to trump the other ones? Like if the sense data says no, or if sense and reason come out to say, no, this is not logically consistent, it doesn't match with the record, then does authority get to come out and say, well, even if it doesn't live up to sense and reason, because I'm an authority, I'm going to say it is so, and you can trust that.
And Dan, I'm going to give you this one, but I just want to make a quick comment on that one. You do that, Jonathan, with laws related to relativism or Einstein's theories, quantum theory. You don't have any sense data that confirms any of that. And these things don't make sense by logic, like that time slows down. Actually, you could make an argument that there is logic to it, that they're able to show through mathematical formulas. But sense data, you definitely, and we do regularly trust authorities over what we can see because we just can't see it. Like, you've never seen an atom. Maybe everyone's lying about electrons.
Well, I think it's a good point, and it kind of reminds me of that moment where people discovered microorganisms in the microscope, because before then there were all these theories about how disease and how germs existed, but once they were able to see it, then they were able to kind of make some sense of how diseases were communicated. And I think on the issue of like quantum physics and quantum mechanics, these theories have been able to exist, and there have been predictions based on those theories, which have facilitated technologies that we rely on, even for the purpose of like this, podcast and stuff. So there are some things for which that understanding is, and it's my understanding that the way that our system of knowledge is based now is that we have a system of provisional truth where all of the data points, all of the experimental disconfirming type of data allows us to generate hypotheses that so far have survived the various challenges that we have at them. But there are provisional truths. It is entirely possible that we could discover on the margins of our understanding something where it doesn't match up, where the laws, for example, of Newtonian physics don't match up. And so it opens a door for people to try to postulate a new hypothesis, a new system of understanding that could both explain the old system and account for these marginal cases. And it's that open-ended nature of that realm of the scientific process, which does allow us both to hold claims to be provisionally true now, but also open ourselves up to the fact that we may not have a complete understanding. And that, when I look back on the evolution from Newtonian physics to kind of the quantum physics realm, even though I can't see the various particles talked about in quantum physics, the logic and the predictions that are made on it give us a basis upon which to hold a provisional belief that at a certain level our understanding is good. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the logic and outcomes manifest it to you.
Yeah. So, and it's the difficult thing here is going back to what Jacob said just a second ago. You need to look for both confirming and disconfirming evidences of things. Well, but at the same time, there is this concept of analysis paralysis. You have decisions to make in life. Do I get my kids vaccinated, for example? Do I, there comes a point where you have to be settled enough in your epistemology to where you say, okay, if I keep analyzing, it's just diminishing returns from here on out. I need to be settled enough to make a decision without the level of knowledge that I would like to have, right? And that is actually true of a lot of very important decisions that we make. And but going back to what Jonathan was talking about with the scientific method, and Jonathan, I don't know if you've read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, but
No.
So I highly recommend it. And he's a historian of science, and he talks about this, how do paradigm, he was probably the one who coined the term paradigm shift when it comes to the hard sciences. And he talks about situations where scientists have struggled to let go of their previous paradigm. And because they, a lot of times they become personally invested in it. This is their life's work. And now it's being thrown out by a new discovery. And there is this non-rational attachment to the old way of thinking. And so here's, I guess what I'm saying here is we need to really, really pay attention to these non-rational factors within us. And all of us have these things that about ourselves, if you want to get into psychology and call it the subconscious, what are the things that are motivating me wanting to hold on to this information when, hey, there are some good reasons to either doubt or update this information, right? Or and transfer to a new paradigm. Now,
and I think that human aspect of it makes it hard. So in this question of, okay, so we've got a flat earther, maybe you're confronted with a flat earther and you say, okay, hold on, here's some object data, sense data, and some reason that kind of undermine your assertion that the world is flat. How do you reconcile those things? And then they'll say, well, I studied a whole bunch of different things, and I just came to the point where I was in analysis paralysis, and I just kind of trust these are some smart people that, there's like NASA scientists who also believe this flat earth thing. And so I just kind of trust them. So you can see them moving from the sense data reason to say, okay, authority now trumps any contradiction there. So do you see that that's a way that they might approach it? Do you
Yeah. And whenever I present on epistemology, I am, well, on any topic, on any religious topic, when I present, when I give a presentation, I'm very, very upfront about the fact that my personal decision is to value things that I can observe in the present to a far greater extent than things that people say about the past. And honestly, that's a personal decision that I make and it's not an entirely rational one. It's just out of experiences like that conspiracy theory about Homeland Security that just opened my eyes to like the human capacity for generating really sophisticated wrong ideas, right?
Okay.
So
So
if I can observe
to close this
something-
chapter, can I get each of you to just kind of summarize real quick, like what would be your epistemological snapshot of the flat Earth claims? Like how you think?
Yeah,
What is?
I
How would
think
your system of knowledge be able to point
as
out
I
that it's
look at it,
wrong?
as I look at it, it's a scientific question that we're asking. The scientific authorities are not on the side of the flat earthers. Okay. You
Okay.
can show logically why certain things shouldn't happen the way that they happen based on, so I can use logic to realize that the world is actually round. I mean, just one is I look at every other heavenly body and they're all round. So that kind of is a little bit of a logical inference I can run on there. The sense data, if I were to get in a rocket ship and go up, I honestly do have to say this though. All three of us, we don't actually have the sense data to say the world is round. We are always trusting on authority because it isn't actually direct sense data that we're getting. Even if you're getting a photograph, you are trusting that the authority that gave you that photograph didn't manipulate it. And
yeah, this is one where authority reigns supreme. It really does.
It is. It truly is. Also, but outcomes, you could say that
Yes.
the flat Earth model does not work for certain things, right?
Right.
And just intuitively, I don't know that intuition plays a huge role in this one, but I think intuitively, if I look around and see that all celestial bodies are round, I can intuit that ours is round too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can have even something like a bubble where it just shows that mass, there's an efficient shape for a collection of mass in a gravitational field.
Right.
Now that you mentioned that authority reigns supreme here, if we go back in time to the discovery of the heliocentric, or I guess the shift from the heliocentric model of the universe from basically the Earth being the center of the universe, there was an authority in existence then, and there was somebody who was using sense data and reason to blow apart the old system, and authority then imposed its will on those other things. What's the difference there? How does that change perhaps or moderate our understanding of where authority fits into this witness to reality?
Well, there also were authorities that said things just to balance this out, not make it a science versus religion. There were a lot of authorities that said that Black people are inferior to white people scientifically. So there are authorities that will make claims. Authority is not something that just exists within religion, right? And we should trust authority to a certain degree, but you're right that authority can't be trusted at the expense of all others. None of these witnesses can reign supreme, because the moment that you say that one of them is the place where we get the infallible truth, you're wrong, because none of the sources are ever infallible. Even if you have the conference of the greatest brain surgeons in the world, they're not infallible. They are a reliable source of information on a particular topic. And so, in matter, but ultimately, in matters of science, when you're describing the physical world, I trust my eyeballs more than any authority out there when it comes to a scientific truth. Because someone can say like, this table in front of you isn't there. And I'm just like, I don't care what your authority is. Like, it's here. I see it.
Right.
I think the sense data ultimately is a better, it gets a much heavier weight than authority in scientific claims analysis.
Okay. Now, in our conversations before this, I did say that you guys were welcome to kind of grill me a little bit on my perspective on it. And certainly before we move on to the Scientology realm, want to give you a chance to do that. I don't know if any questions come to. I haven't really made any positive assertions here. I tend to, in this question and in the question of epistemology in general, I do hold on to a provisional notion of truth, which is that there always needs to be you always need to be open to the idea that you might be wrong. So you
Yes.
always have to consider claims and
Agreed.
challenge things. I do hold to the idea that there are things that you can't really apply things like falsifiability to that are in the realm of kind of human metaphysical things. But as soon as you get to a claim for which there could be some sort of test or challenge to, then you have to go through the threshold of burden of proof. You have to be able to establish an assertion. You can't just assert something and then ask someone to disprove it. And that I guess a disconfirming data point is very powerful, and it should lead you to reconsider your premises. And I guess, and the authority thing. So the other thing is that authority should not matter. And that is that if we're testing an objective scientific claim, it should match a challenge to it independent of authority. So you could have somebody who on their own, without a degree, comes up with a hypothesis and is able to test it and challenge it, publish it, and other people can test it and challenge it and publish it. And it doesn't really matter what the authorities say if those challenges and the logic and the sense data and, well, more of the logic aspect of it and the outcomes for the challenges match it. Now, all of those things understood take a kind of an overlay of the way that we communicate in the academic world is very human. And there's politics and there's human psychology and there's all these different things that overlay how we perceive those things. And so that's where I see the scientific method as a way to try to overcome those inherent biases. And so when I hear people take what I consider to be a postmodern position, which is, hey, we all have biases, so I'm going to own my bias and lean into my bias and allow that bias to color my data, because we all have biases and you can't escape bias. I consider that a non-scientific, pseudoscientific approach, rather than saying we all have biases, and because we have these biases, we're going to intentionally do things that challenge our biases in order to try to poke through them and try to make sure that we're accounting for them in our understanding of the data and the stuff, I guess.
And I would say, to that, Jonathan,
rant.
that no, you're fine. You're using all the same tools that are right here in the collective witnesses. And what you're really
I think
doing
there's
is
a lot of overlap.
Yeah, and I think what's going on, largely what you're discussing, is you're talking about the logical sort of system that this all needs to fit within, because the data still needs to be processed logically. And you're right. Ultimately, it's illogical to go with an authority on a matter of scientific, question over direct sense data, like, that and other outcomes of experiments and things like that show that the authorities are wrong. But again, that fits within this model. It fits within the idea of the witness of reason or logic, that these things have to be consistent with that. And I agree with you. So I'm not actually disagreeing with you. I actually think that all of that needs to be taken into account within this system of information. And so, yes, we have to first get the right data, and then we have to process that data according to the laws of logic, because that is, we found that those laws govern the way reality actually works. And Dan, do you have anything to say on that? I don't want to take over all of it.
Okay. Yeah, and I think we would all agree we're in kind of a quandary in our current state right now, where institutions we previously relied on as authorities in the academic realm have kind of delegitimized their authority. Because when you talk about authority, there needs to be a distinguishing dividing line between authority that is legitimate and is justified by its ongoing coherence to, a system of understanding reality, and those right. for which they may have been, I guess, captured by a particular bias.
So real quick, this is a perfect segue to an analogy I wanted to bring into this conversation. Joseph Lawal of LDS Philosophy, he once was talking about this on a podcast. He actually came up with it on the fly, which was brilliant because I think it's a great analogy. He called it the parable of the green light prophet. And so let's say you have somebody who says to you, Jonathan, hey, you're going to hit all green lights on your way to work today. And you hit all green lights on your way to work. It's like, to some degree, you're like, wow, like maybe this guy has some ability to do something that where he can predict green lights. And then he says, Jonathan, you're going to hit green lights for the next year. And then you hit green lights for the next year. And so now you're like, you're like, at some point you're convinced, like there's enough anomalies here that you're convinced. Now, let's say that in November, you hit a single red light. Okay. Now, does that blow everything up? Is he for sure not because he was mistaken in some way? We can say for sure that we know for a fact that this green light prophet was indeed, we can't say that he's infallible, that what he said is 100% true, but we still can at some level say there's something going on here. This guy seems to be able to do something like, and at some point, the data, it is actually reasonable to believe that someone has some special ability. You don't have to say it's supernatural. You could say he's, he has a tracker on my car and he's put this technology in the signal. So every time I pass one, it turns green, right? And so it isn't magic. It's just some technology that he has that he's able to do this. But my whole point is just, and this doesn't have to be applied to religious situations. Ultimately, authority is established on outcomes. It's established based on a person saying that X, Y, Z will happen, and then it happens.
No, and I think there's an analogy for that in the scientific realm, where one of the things that does establish the validity of something is its predictive power. And so if you come up with a formula or a hypothesis about some physical manifestation of our world and working through that system, you're able to predict things, then it gives some credibility to the hypothesis itself.
Yep. And that's
the margins of that will be limited by when those predictions go wrong. And that's where we see how scientific paradigms have evolved over time. Now, in regards to the green light prophet, I think if someone was trying to use that analogy on the question of personal human psychological things, it probably wouldn't show up as a green light. It would show up as something like, something really meaningful to you is going to happen. And this happens, like, for example, in astrology, where somebody reads their sign, they read their horoscope, something meaningful, and they can say at the end of it, wow, for this whole year, all of my horoscopes have totally matched on. But that's because what you have is an integration and a projection of a human psychology onto vague statements that we, as kind of meaning-making machines, will find meaning and purpose. And if it points then to the validity of a assertion that this horoscope is somehow pertinent to your life, or if it's a guru that has given you some prediction, but it's a prediction that is rooted in your own interpretation of it and in a meaning that he may even plant the seed of that meaning, then you could have someone who it's the equivalent of a bunch of green lights, but it's so vague and has such of a human element to it that I don't know that it really applies to that particular scenario. All right, so Dan is mentioning that we have, I know Dan's on a limited time schedule, so let's go ahead and move to the realm and cross the threshold into the religious realm, into the realm of Scientology. So, there's some basic things about Scientology. It includes a kind of an understanding that we as humans are not the simple organic creatures that we are. Our bodies are infused with thetans, and these thetans actually manifest in our life as bad thoughts, negative outcomes, unhealthy thought processes, unhealthy actions. And it is really through understanding the nature of our existence as these beings inhabited by thetans, going through the program prescribed by L. Ron Hubbard, going and doing the auditing so that we can purge ourselves of these things and get clear. That's how we can actualize ourselves in our most pure and best form. And so there's some claims there about the nature of reality and our existence as humans. how do you guys apply your 5 witness model to that paradigm?
Well, Scientology has a number of types of claims. They have historical claims too, that, of things that happened millions of years ago, right? And so, are those verifiable? Are there witnesses to any of those things? Can we evaluate witnesses? Can we, and when you talk about Thetan, this kind of being or essence or whatever, is that something that we can measure? Is there anything that I can point to in terms of sense data to say this exists? And then, obviously you have these processes that they want to take people through. Well, do those have replicable results and measurable results? And what amounts to authority in Scientology? How does somebody qualify as an authority? What have they achieved something that gives them a credential of some kind? And so, these are all questions to ask. And if a Scientologist has a very simple epistemology that ignores all of these other, seats at the table and just says, hey, authority is this individual, and I don't care about any of these other factors, then obviously they're going to be more inclined to embrace that belief system than I will, because I'm going to evaluate, I want to see things. I want to observe things, right? And so anyway, Jacob?
I would say, so first of all, within Scientology, it's a religious belief. And so I differ from them about the nature of God, right? So anytime I'm exploring a religious belief, I have to go the fundamental of the let's say properly religious belief, meaning a belief in a higher power or deity or something like that, is I want to go to that level of the conversation, and I want to see, okay, is there any such thing as a higher power? And a Scientologist and I would probably agree that there's some sort of a higher power in the universe that we give the label God to, right? And I'm not super familiar with Scientology, so if this is incorrect, then maybe our difference is even more fundamental than that.
I don't think that they have a God figure.
Okay, so if they don't have a God figure, then that right there is the level of disagreement. I would have to have a discussion with them about why they're atheists, essentially. Like a religious claim has to go from the ground up for me. And the very first question of a properly religious thing is, are you a theist? And if they're not a theist and they're an atheist, therefore we have to have a conversation about that, right? Before we get to theons, any other kind of stuff that they're talking about. I don't know what that stuff is because I'm not super familiar with Scientology. But my point is that I'm taking it from that level. Now, so unless they can convince me that there is no God, then I'm like, they have to present a model that is plausible based on these witnesses at that level of analysis. Okay. And so unless they made that
I see
case,
you doing is starting with this what you consider to be a foundational claim or a premise, and saying, since we don't share that premise, then there's really no way to move forward because that premise predicates everything else that follows. So if you had a kid then if you had a loved one, for example, that got swept up into Scientology, and you felt the call on your heart to try to help open their eyes to the fact that they were in a system that was going to exploit them financially, potentially, and imprison them and psychologically abuse them, because the survivors of Scientology say this is what goes on. How would you approach that, knowing that you couldn't really opt out? You had to engage at some level.
I would engage at the most fundamental level. Go ahead, Dan.
No, I first of all, you have to, when you look at a system that is not your own system, you have to say, what is the logic of this system? Like, why does this work for some people? Why do people adhere to it? And systems have claims, and systems have their own epistemologies. We don't like that fact, but it's just reality, right? So I studied Islam years ago in college, but I couldn't understand the internal logic of Islam. Why does somebody adhere to this system? Until I lived in the Middle East and had a lot more interaction with Muslims, and I could see, okay, I see why you think this system is valid. Even if I don't, I see the logic of the system and how you relate to it. And once you can do that, then you can have some actually productive discussions, which are going to be around epistemology, right? If I go and challenge a Scientologist and say, oh, your whole system is wrong and there's a God, I'm going to get nowhere. But we can have discussions about, how do we know what is true? How do I evaluate claims using different witnesses, like Jacob talks about? And I call them seats at the table: our rationality, our intuition, our observation, witness testimony, and all of these kinds of things. How do I bring these together? And if somebody is in a system where there is a really unhealthy authority dynamic, you can have a very helpful discussion. And I'm going to say this even about my faith, my religious system as a Latter-day Saint. It is possible to process my religion in a way where there's an unhealthy authority dynamic. I want my kids to evaluate authority in conjunction with these other things, right? And also account for their biases and all of those kinds of things. Those conversations are so much more productive because they're neutral. And I'm not attacking somebody.
I agree with that. And I think in Scientology, there is a strong leaning on that authority paradigm of their epistemology, because they consider they call L. Ron Hubbard source. Yeah. And he's the source of truth, and the things that they can attribute to him become foundational for everything else. So then a former Scientologist who was exposed to all of the contradictory data points in the life of L. Ron Hubbard and the illegitimacy of his claims from an outsider's perspective could approach someone and say, hey, I've got all of these different issues with L. Ron Hubbard. I don't want to be accused of a gish gallop, so let me just give you one. And then they give him something that shows that that his claim to have some special knowledge about the universe is born more out of his science fiction imagination than it is out of an actual connection with being able to match his sayings with reality. And that person then says, well, I really focus just on what I can see before me. I don't pay attention to things that happened a long time ago. And right now, the leadership has us, we're doing good. We're all around the world, and they've only been exposed to the good parts and not the bad parts. How do you break through that shell for them as well as for yourself? Like, it sounds like the way you just because somebody in the comments is asking, this is supposed to be about how they reject epistemology, not how they convince a Scientologist. How they reject Scientology, not how they convince a Scientologist. And I think you guys kind of already laid that down. Since you don't agree with the authority or the foundational claims, then you've delegitimized it already at that point.
Yeah, and you have to go down to, if you want to actually work with anyone or even yourself evaluate the truth claims, you have to go to, like, where is the common ground here? Like, if I dig down, like, all right, do you believe in a God as a Scientologist? And they say no. It's like, okay, I can't agree. We're not theists. We're not together on that. So I got to go even deeper. And I go, okay, do you, like, now we're getting into those levels of epistemology where I'm sort of like, how do you even know what's true? Like, where can we find it? Like, you're like, I believe in what I see.
Let's say that they push back up on you when you say, do you believe in God? And they say no, but you're making a claim about the existence of God, so you've got the burden of proof to demonstrate that. How do you know that there's a God? Like, where do you? Well, and they're doing that thing where we check our premises and look at our premises and then.
But I would go back. See, I would go back even deeper to, how do we even answer that question if there's a God? You know what I mean? Until we come up with some shared framework that we're going to explore questions with, we won't get anywhere, because we're just not bringing the same tools to the table. And so the discussion has to be about the tools that we bring to the table, because I always want to, if I really want to work and influence someone and actually have a real conversation rather than a debate, what we need to do is we need to find out where we agree first. Because the thing is if a person doesn't value rationality, for instance, they don't value logic and reason, I can't even engage in conversation with them, because conversation is an exercise in rationality and logic. Like that's what words are. They're expressions to link ideas together in logical chains to convey ideas. And when a person doesn't even value logical consistency, when you can't convince them using logic, you've like, that's just not a tool that's even available.
If you're having this conversation with a Scientologist and you bring up some data point about L. Ron Hubbard and they say, and then they say, well, what about Joseph Smith? And they bring up some data point about Joseph Smith. And then you say, and then they accuse you of, well, you're not really rational. You don't allow rationality to enter your dialogue. Therefore, I'm not going to dialogue with you. Like, how do you make sense of that?
We can both take our scale and we can point to, here's a reason to doubt L. Ron Hubbard. Here's a reason to doubt Joseph Smith. Here's a reason to doubt atheism. Here's a reason to doubt postmodernism. And you can do
it's a conversation that will go nowhere.
Exactly. It just doesn't go anywhere.
It will, like, for a lot of these, I'm just going to be real. You have to just kind of give up on the idea that you're going to convince another person to your point of view
using logic.
Yeah. You're just going to argue somebody out of their entrenched position. I resist that. We all do, and so what makes me think that I'm going to do that I'm going to be successful with somebody else. But you can have very neutral and productive conversations around epistemology. You can. And so from there,
I guess it would be helpful, I think, because epistemology does not exist only in dialogue with a believer. I think we can all confront the question of epistemology just on our own. And so that, I think, if you guys, listened to claims of Scientology, sounds like you've already made the case that because you don't have a shared vocabulary or shared premises about the nature of God, which are foundational to Mormonism, even though they may be absent in Scientology, well,
that's Jacob's position. That's not my position.
Okay,
you're articulating.
What about you, Dan? If just in a vacuum now, considering the claims of, how do you reject it with your epistemology?
If I'm in conversation with a Scientologist, I'm not going to be thinking about whether there's a God or not. I'm going to be thinking about
not if you're in conversation, if you're just thinking about it yourself, how do you reject it?
Scientology. Again, it's that witness model. Are there grounds for warranted belief in any of these claims? And frankly, there might be for some. Scientologists they have a deep skepticism towards psychiatry, right?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of us nowadays have a lot of skepticism toward at least the excesses of the field of psychiatry. So a lot of us agree with Scientologists on some pretty important things. But aside from that, those are areas where our epistemologies converge, or even if our epistemologies don't converge, we're still arriving at the same outcome. Well, but claims that aliens dropped nuclear bombs in volcanoes millions of years ago, I don't have any basis for evaluating that claim. No witnesses, no outcome experience, nothing. So I
think you used a key statement. You used the term justified belief. Can you kind of tell us what that means?
There's nothing, there's no belief that I can point to where I can say, okay, I would be justified in believing that on some grounds somewhere. Other than
when somebody says, well, how do you justify your belief? You would point to something like the 5-witness model.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I need to leave. So,
okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing what time you could with us, Dan. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you guys continue the conversation. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Dan.
All right. So I think that may be a good point for us to move on to the part of our discussion where we talk about the LDS Church, which is basically, and it's kind of that same thing where how does your epistemology then approach the claims of the church itself?
So I think the most important thing to do with this question about the church specifically is Latter-day Saints live in a bubble a lot of the times, and they don't realize what the church actually is and what it is not. Okay. The church is a specific set of claims about Christianity. Okay. That's the if you want to put what is essentially Mormon rather than just generally Christian, right? Because we have a ton of stuff that we share in common with Christians, and we have a ton of things we share in common with theists, right? It's like we're getting more specific. What the church is, it's an institution that claims to hold the keys of the kingdom given to Peter. Okay? That's in essence what the church's fundamental claim is. Okay? Even beyond any of the other stuff, right? Because that's what makes it the true church. It's that you hold the keys of the kingdom that were given to Peter, and therefore you can bind on earth and in heaven and all that kind of stuff. Now there may be more to that, but what I'm saying though is this is a conversation about Christianity, okay? Mormonism specifically. Now, so Mormonism is built on Christian premises, right? It's built on the premise that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, that he calls prophets, that you can know a prophet's legitimacy by their fruits. The premise that there is a quorum of 12 apostles that existed a long time ago that were given special authority. And so you have to understand what questions Mormonism specifically is answering. So if you want to ask me about Mormonism specifically, then I'm going to say, well, I believe in Mormonism because of these Christian things that I also accept that are not unique to Mormonism. And I would say I believe in Christianity based on a theist foundation as I search for God. So if I were a truth seeker, I'm seeking God I'm seeking truth in the universe, the true nature of the universe, right? First, I got to do an epistemological check to see how can I know what's true about the universe at all. And then I can approach questions like, there either is a God or there's not. There's something that qualifies as this higher power or there isn't, right? And then I have to weigh up the scales of the reasons to believe and the reasons to doubt the two different hypotheses. And then you arrive at theism, right? But no, I believe in a higher power. There's a lot of people like that. But then as you drill down into that conversation, then you start to get to Mormonism. And at each level of the conversation, I'm utilizing this model because there are things that are totally unreasonable to somebody that become reasonable if in fact it is true that Jesus Christ rose from the dead on the third day and the New Testament is fundamentally true. All of a sudden, things that seem totally out there and crazy, like miraculous angels appearing to people and prophets who can manifest the will of God to the world, like these are just like orders of level of crazy to certain people, but to someone who accepts Christ, they're not orders of level crazy. They're part of the conversation.
Right. And that's by the same paradigm, a Scientologist would say, well, thetans and nuclear bombs and volcanoes sounds crazy to people who haven't gone through the ladder to divine or to whatever they call it, to fulfillment, or there's a name for it.
And I would say, let's go down the ladder. Let's go down as far as we can go to how did you arrive at the belief that volcanoes are being, nukes are being dropped into volcanoes. And then, that's crazy. And then I'll go with somebody like a Bill Reel and I'll go down as deep as I can and then go to like where you're talking about, is there any basis for any sort of morality or agency or rationality and you reach these absurdities. And what's really funny is I've done this.
I think it strikes me as
absurdities in almost every worldview.
Yeah, it strikes me as when you start into the realm of morality, that's maybe not a scientific discussion, but an ethical discussion. And so the question of epistemology usually is confined to the realm of things that can be objectively tested. And there was something
I reject at the start. If you and I were to go down and figure, okay, where are the roots of our disagreement? I believe in epistemology that merely embraces scientific truth as the only truth that is worth talking about. This is sort of the logical positivist camp, or Karl Popper's falsification sort of principle, where he differentiates between, says, look, anything that's not falsifiable is not a scientific truth. And I agree with that statement. He's right. The question is there any other truth besides scientific truth?
Oh, okay. Well, actually, this is a great way to just kind of include in this discussion what to me was probably the most significant discussion that I had that kind of changed my paradigm on a lot of these things, and that was growing up in Mormonism. Its claims and its kind of worldview are very much rooted in kind of a materialist, logical, kind of concrete way,
Mhm.
and so that's kind of how I analyzed truth claims and how I looked and approached the truth. And it was really through turning my eyes back onto the history of the church that I was not able to reconcile its claims with that mode of thinking. But since you bring it up, this concept that there are different forms of truth kind of should expand your mind to say, well, hold on a second, there's a little bit more, there's something different going on in the realm of religion than this. But the problem is we're now conflating, we're using the same word for two different things, and that leads to miscommunication. And so I think, how would you, what is there a better way to, when you talk about truth in objective scientific terms, that's different from when you talk about truth in human terms, in terms of like a life that can be well lived, can be guided by these principles, and it's true that there will be a positive outcome about that. Like, that's a different type of truth. That's a human truth. There's a subjective element perhaps to it, but there's also a human psychological element that will have some reproducibility and some predictive power to it. So
Yeah,
I guess,
I think so. You have to when we're talking about truth, what are we talking about? We're talking about reality. One of the big questions you have to start with is to ask, well, what is the nature of reality? And if you say that reality is reduced to mere molecules in motion, my brother actually just released a video where he talks about the principle of emergence. It was really funny because I was laughing because I was kind of like, that's kind of our point, is that there is a world that emerges from this fundamental stuff, right? And that world is just as real as the stuff itself. In fact, you might say it's even more real. Like, there are aspects of reality that are, again, if you just look at reality in terms of scientific matter in motion, you can reduce the world to physics and chemistry alone. But that doesn't actually accurately describe the full breadth of reality, because reality includes consciousness. And so there's this whole world of what is this entire realm of conscious human existence and experience, what you might call to use a religious word, a spiritual realm, a realm that exists outside of just mere physicality. And that is a realm that I believe exists, that is just as real as the table in front of me right now, and that is governed also by laws. And that is why, as you've said, aspects of this sort of metaphysical realm are predictable. It's also ordered. And so you can utilize models of understanding to predict principles and truths about the nature of this metaphysical realm.
would you agree that that metaphysical realm, like the way that you establish truth perhaps in that realm is different from the way that you establish truth in the objective physical reality realm?
Absolutely. Now, I would say
Okay,
that
so this is where I think
overlap.
when people talk
There
about
are overlaps, though.
epistemology, yeah, when people talk about epistemology, we're really focused on this objective reality and truth claim realms, and the truth claims that people are concerned about are these things that can be testable. So you mentioned before in the difference that you
Well, I
have
would,
with a Scientologist,
real
you would
quick,
start.
real quick, I just want to pause you because I actually don't agree with that.
Okay.
Epistemology is the conversation about if things like only scientific objectable truths, like that's all that we deal with. My epistemology says no. An epistemology that only recognizes scientific truth, that adheres to a strict falsifiability principle, is a one-eyed epistemology. It's like you're walking
Well,
through
no,
life
no,
without
but
opening your other eye.
it's not that it. So confining an epistemology to testable assertions is not saying that those other realms don't exist. It's simply saying that the tool does not apply to those realms. It's kind of like saying, that economic terms, like economics is a science of like incentives, and there's a very human factor, and things that would use in an epistemology for objective reality that are physical, unchangeable, immutable aspects of reality is different from something that is going to interface with the chaos that is human existence. And so it's okay to say there's an epistemology that deals with claims that can be tested, and then there's also aspects of human existence which you can't really apply that to. And so when I see someone like the Karl Popper thing, he's saying this is for scientific claims. This is not for claims about human existence, about the love of a mother for their child or the interaction of human endeavor. This is just for scientific claims. And so if somebody says something like God exists, then that is kind of, it's straddling the line. But as soon as they say God exists and the world is 700 years old, it's like, okay, so now we've got something that is more than just a human endeavor, because humans could say God exists, but to me, God is an ephemeral ideal to which a human life can aspire. Well, that's an untestable claim.
You're right. It is.
And God exists, and he told me that the earth is 700 years old. It's like, okay, well, now we have an objective claim. And so let's remove the God, remove the religion. Let's just test the claim without considering what authority said it, without considering what the implications might be to a group of people who have, built a building with the word 700 on it or something, just to see if the claim is true. And are there any data inputs that we could look at to test that? And so to me, when I am talking about epistemology, it's on that. Now, the reason that is important in my mind when you reflect on the religious thing is because some religious charlatans have used claims that could be challenged and refuted using these epistemological tools in order to maintain their authority. And in that authority, they have capitalized on psychological vulnerabilities that humans have in order to get people to disregard all of the intuition, outcome, sense data, and reason and rely solely on their authority.
Yep.
And human psychology, has levers that you can pull that will certainly put you in that direction.
Yep.
And so and it's not the only mechanism, but one way to get people out of that spell, if we want to call it that, would be to point out the inconsistencies between the authority and their claims of objective reality. And so I think in the issue of old religion or something like that, it's harder to do that because it's not as recent. But the reason a lot of people are easy to point at L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology is because it's recent enough. We have records. We can say, hold on a second, he said this, the record shows this, there's something wrong there. And then those Scientologists would defend L. Ron Hubbard in the same breath that they would point to David Koresh or Joseph Smith or any other religious person for whom there are claims that they have made that fall within the realm of objective reality that can be tested. And if you have someone who says you're going to hit green lights, God told me so, then if you don't hit the green lights, that could be a hint that God didn't tell him so. Or if you hit a bunch of green lights and then you hit a red light, at least it should raise the question. But like I said, that analogy is a little bit too rigid for human psychology in and of itself.
Yeah,
I guess so. That's kind of the stakes I see it when we look at this, because it comes important when we get to the next chapter, which is how can you hold on to the LDS and impeach the FLDS. And so,
real quick,
the way that I understand it, if I was going to say, okay, how does Jacob use his epistemological system to believe the truth claims of the LDS Church? He believes that I don't know. You start out with saying, well, first of all, I believe in God, I believe in Christ, and I believe on the what Mormonism has held on to and put forward based on those foundations. And so, if I was going to categorize, it seems like authority is a big part of that, because the claim to hold the keys of Peter is an authority claim based on the person who claimed to have it. The Catholic Church could make a competing authority claim. And so then we've got to say, okay, well,
We debate that.
Mormonism will impeach the Catholic Church because they'll say they lost the authority. Well, how do we know like, how do you sort through all that? Is it authority is your foundational, strongest?
Oh, no, definitely
primary
not.
one, or how do you?
No, Latter-day Saints would appeal primarily to an experiential knowledge as their foundation. But before we go into that, because that's a whole rabbit hole, I want to talk a little bit about unhealthy authority. Like, I agree. In fact, one of the reasons I will rail against my fellow Latter-day Saints is when they begin to adopt a blind obedience paradigm. And I reject that. I don't think that you blindly follow an authority for the exact reasons that you're pointing out. Because an authority, like if someone else were to have that sort of blind obedience to L. Ron Hubbard, there's no way to get them out of it. They have taken one of the witnesses and they have crowned it king and said, and by the way, this is what the Calvinists and Protestants do with the Bible. They say, yep, that's it. The authority of the authority alone heresy, as I call it, right? You have people who will, and this can be in any sphere, not just in religious spheres. The other Christians do it with the Bible. The Bible is the ultimate authority. It's the infallible word of God. There are people who do that with the scientific establishment, where they will not ever question anything that a consensus of the scholars say. It's like if you lived in 1935 and the scholarly consensus was that black people were inferior, you'd believe it because you just go along with whatever the scholarly consensus is. And so the model exists in a way that's meant to provide checks and balances to these competing claims, including unhealthy authority claims. And you're right. I do not believe that like if you're going to evaluate the leaders of my church on their claims on particular scientific matters, it's a pretty mixed bag. Okay. I'm not going to say that they've shown like the green light prophet of hitting it down the line right down the way. So I don't look at them. If I want to know scientifically, I don't go ask Russell M. Nelson, about the boiling point of water. I go ask a scientist and then utilize the experiments. So one of the questions like that Bill's bringing up, going after me for the, they're unreliable in relation to what questions? Because if I'm approaching it, asking myself, my question is fundamentally, are these guys the modern day version of Peter, Paul, and Moses? Right?
That carries the assumption that Peter, Paul, and Moses represented something authoritative at that time.
Exactly. I'm coming from the Christian presuppositions. Okay. And so this, again, it's a conversation about Christianity. And that's the reason.
No, I mean, epistemology is not a conversation about Christianity. It's a question about how do you separate justified claims from those which are not justified.
You're right. So let's say
in a systematic way that you can then apply to any question.
Yeah. And so let's say that I have independently justified Christianity as a worldview.
Okay. And now so I guess people would say, how did you do that?
You're right. That's the whole conversation about Christianity. And there's a whole, like we could do a whole episode on how do I justify Christianity, but that would be predicated. The reasons I would be giving would be predicated on a belief in theism. So think of it this way. I like to use this analogy.
Then people will say, which God? I mean, a belief in God, which God? How do you assert that?
Yes.
But I think the question that
remember, Jonathan,
the direction we're going, because the next direction we're going is going to include all those things that you said, but then go one step further
into what I call the fourth level of conversation, which is the conversation that happens within Mormonism about the FLDS.
Okay. Well, I think it's good that you've established that you don't believe it's authority that justifies the truth claims of the church in an extreme way. Like for you, it's all five of them.
Provide a
not
reliable...
one of them gets to trump the other, but that means that none of them get to falsify the other. So if somebody brings up some logical point that shows that a claim to a really key important part of the authority, for example, like the priesthood or something like that, you're not going to allow them to, you're not going to give credibility to that point because you don't allow any one of the 5 witnesses to impeach the others.
You want to actually know, you want to know which one would get me out of the church? If you can
Say
show
again?
that the brethren do not align with Jesus Christ. So for instance, if the brethren were to come out, as you guys, a lot of people are predicting that they're going to endorse gay marriage. Well, guess what, guys? I'm going to be out there at the bar drinking with y'all as soon as that happens. Because the thing
I
is,
still haven't drunk at a bar like that. I don't understand.
Jonathan,
what the
yes,
appeal
you're
is.
the man. No, and I'm obviously I'm being kind of a little hyperbole here, but my point is that the metric that I use to evaluate the brethren is Jesus Christ. In fact, I only approach the Mormon church, as it were, to use the bad word term of it. I only approach it because I believe that it represents Jesus Christ. That's the whole thing. That's the only
So
reason I even
it
care about
sounds
this
like
church.
then you would resonate with the people who, for example, read the happiness letter and believe that what it conveys to Nancy Rigdon cannot be the voice of God as it
Yes.
is said in the first person, and does sound more like a sexual predator. You could understand why someone, if they held that same thing, which is as soon as an authority in the church, particularly, I mean, it may be that's a prophet between Joseph and the current ones, you'd probably give a little bit of leeway to, but certainly if this purportedly comes from Joseph, and then that would be an impeachable offense for him to engage in behavior that could only be seen as sexual predation.
So those are the strong arguments. If you want to look at the ones that on the reasons to doubt side of the scale, remember, because this isn't like, oh, there's a bean on that side, therefore it must be false, because I have to consider the other things as well. But if you want to talk about what are the big ones, anytime you're showing that they don't align with Jesus Christ, that's where you get somebody like me who's coming at this from a Christian worldview going, I don't know that this is right. And so that is the way to go about, like, if you want to point to the big ones and try and make those big ones bigger, that's how you do it.
And I guess, how do you, there's examples in human history of the doubling down. There have been a couple of religious movements that have set a date, for example, on the return of Christ, and it's been a religious figure claiming divine sanction to make that prediction. It doesn't happen, and everyone thinks, well, that means the group is going to dissolve, everyone's going to go their own way, and they're going to try to figure out what went wrong. But instead, belief becomes ingrained even more. They find a post hoc rationalization that actually gives them an even more powerful reason to believe. Perhaps they weren't pure enough. God has decided to give them a chance to, be even better, to justify his return. And so it's that that psychological phenomenon. How do you make sure that it doesn't happen, or that it's not operating in your own mind? Or is there a way to do that? Because I think epistemology, to one extent, it's trying to cut through some of these human biases that exist. And as soon as you allow certain things to subvert the epistemology, for example, saying, well, I'm going to rely a credibility on authority, when other people, their epistemology is shaped specifically to get out of the bias that comes along with allowing authority to have any say at all in the way that it operates. How do you do that? Because when it happens, because there's been plenty of people who've said, you know what, that is very unchristian, I'm out, in studying church history.
Yeah.
But then there's other people that says, well, it sounds unchristian, but let's look at the context. Oh, Joseph was trying, he was trying to incorporate a new doctrine, and he messed up a little bit, and it's all good.
Let's use it here. Let's use this as an example. Okay. Let's say that you had an experience where you're in your room tonight, you go in, you go to bed, and an angel appears in your bedroom, and you have the most life-changing spiritual experience, not only spiritual warm and fuzzies, but like an actual apparition of something that makes absolutely no sense in your room. And they say, look, it's true. Like, just so you know. And then the next day you get up and you're confronted with all of the same problems. What you do is you start to create ways to make sense of what's gone on here. We try and make things make sense based on the data that we see. What we try and do anytime we have, because here's here's an example. The way, think about it again, the scales. That experience would be like putting a boulder on the reasons to believe side of the scale, right? Now you can say, oh, I must have been hallucinating, but let's just like, fine. But you now have things on the other side of the scale that are still there. And when someone brings them up, you're going to try your best to provide an explanation for why this is, even though you had that experience. Now, at some point you might say, there's so much still on this side of the scale, the reasons to not believe, that I must have been hallucinating. I must have been like, this must have just been something crazy. But again, it all comes down to these scales and what you have on them. And the people who have had powerful experiences in one direction, and this isn't just for believers. Again, we can apply this universally. Anytime, even the Scientologists, they've had something that has put rocks in their reasons to believe side of the scale. And so you need to minimize the reasons to believe, and you need to maximize the reasons to disbelieve. And that's what people do, because no one wants to feel like they're wrong. So like, you don't want to feel like you're wrong. So you're going to push back on arguments that people give for reasons to believe. And I'm going to push back on those because we want to justify that, hey, I wasn't wrong this whole time. That's a natural human thing. And we have to try as best we can to get out of that and as objectively as possible, evaluate the two sides of the scale by looking at all the data.
When Dan was here earlier, he made an important admission, which is that the flat earthers, that there's something very meaningful to them in their belief. And this is something that other people have talked about, post hoc justification, where there's something that has to be true because of what it means to you in your life. And so you're able to, the human mind is very capable of coming up with justifications that make sense. And I think part of the reason that we have the great technology that we have now is because a system of rules that was kind of like a game of how to approach questions of knowledge was made to try to eliminate as much as possible those various aberrations of our cognition of the world, to give us the best set of tools to try to understand the world. And
logic. I would call that logic and sense data when it comes to things like science, for instance. That's what they are. And that is, I fully embrace that as a good and valid and real thing that produces real results in the physical world that we exist in. And I think we exist in a world of so much phenomenal physical abundance. It's shocking. And yet we're all depressed and wanting to kill ourselves.
When another religious charlatan makes some claim about the physical world that then you can use these tests to disprove, and do you think it should impeach the claimed authority of that figure?
Yes.
Like whether it's L. Ron Hubbard or David Koresh.
In relation to that subject. That's why I say I don't go to Russell M. Nelson to although he is a pretty good scientist, or at least, he understands science pretty good. But I would say that, no, I don't look at the leaders of the church as my primary source for speaking authoritatively on matters of science. So
then you don't impeach the entire character of a religious leader if they make a false claim. You just will segment out the realm in which they make that claim. So if L. Ron Hubbard makes some statement about psychiatry or something like that, or that's probably something you'd agree with him on, actually. If he makes some claim about the age of the world, for example, then you would say, okay, well, we don't have to believe L. Ron Hubbard on the age of the world, but maybe there's something about his beliefs on psychiatry. Well, I would say my thing is authority is based on outcomes. So if L. Ron Hubbard has a thing about, hey guys, don't, take this particular drug, and then all of his followers have way better health outcomes because they're not taking this drug that everyone else is taking, then there would be something to say with maybe he got that right. And I think from the perspective of a
someone who's an ex-member of the church, but that still realizes that there's something to this. There is truth in it. Maybe these truths are metaphysical in some way or psychological to where they lead to good outcomes for Latter-day Saints. And we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. But we can reject the church's claims about certain scientific truths, right? And so there's a level, like I'm a believer, and in fact, because of my faith, I'm a believer that we should embrace truth from wherever it comes. And so the world clearly has been blessed by truth in the realm of science, and we should embrace every bit of it.
And so understanding that now, because I think you added a dimension to it, which is that even current religious authorities within the Mormon tradition, you're not going to blanket believe everything that they say, and you admit that they may make a misstatement that could then be shown by other things, and it doesn't necessarily impeach either their authority or their trustworthiness on further statements. Does
On their,
correct me if I'm wrong on any of that.
I guess, how do I evaluate the leaders of the church? Everything is in evaluation to Jesus Christ. Their claim is to be prophets of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so that sets up the standard by which I evaluate if I think there's good reason to believe that that is what they are.
Okay.
Okay.
And does it enter into your calculation that they have cast the spell, so to speak, that they are the mouthpiece of God and of Christ? And so what they say then represents Christ's perspective, and they are the ones who taught you how to interpret and understand Christ. Because that's the thing that you'll see in other paradigms where they say, okay, like a religious leader will say, I've got a new light on what the scriptures mean, on what Christ wants, and I'm the one conveying it to you. And so the people there would be like, well, as long as he matches Christ, I'm with him. And Christ said he was one of the, the risen elect that was going to give birth to the 12 council of elders. So David Koresh is my guy. And he told me so.
It's like, a circular reasoning. It's illogical. It's to say that.
But the thing is, that's what people could perceive your perspective.
Yes, and they do that. And my thing is, Latter-day Saints do that. That is the problem of blind obedience. That is the heresy of authority alone. Because what you do is you say that these authorities speak for God infallibly, and therefore anything they you say you just have to embrace it. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And Joseph Smith himself railed against that very idea. And so,
did Joseph Smith himself ever make any claims in the name of Christ or conveying what Christ said that you say, well, that's not really Christ-like, or that's not really...
off the top of my head, I can't think of one in particular, but I'm sure that they do exist. That's the other thing. Again, do they have to be? I don't think that Peter or Paul or Moses were infallible. And I think that they would make mistakes, and you can even do it in the name of the Lord, or you could claim a revelation that you didn't have or whatever. And now, do these go on the reasons to doubt side of the scale? Yes, they do. Absolutely. But I think the thing that ultimately, again, I'm approaching the question, are these men inspired of Jesus Christ? A question I have often asked is, what does Jesus think of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Let's say there was no true church. Let's say that there is, like, Jesus Christ was the Savior, but all these people who have this idea of a true church, they're wrong. Well, then whatever church you're a part of is really a matter of kind of preference, right? It's kind of like there's no true church. It's just, you just have to like follow Jesus and try and live his teachings, and then you go to heaven. And I can't help but look and say, what does Jesus think of this group? What comes out of this group? Would he say that these are wonderful people? Like in the New Testament, when he said, those who aren't against me or for, or aren't against us or for us. And you could easily make that case that Jesus Christ, that all the churches claims or like these big ones aren't true, but boy, whatever Joseph Smith invented, it sure does help people live good Christian lives the way Christ would want to have them live. And therefore, as a believer in that Christ, I'm willing to, this is a great church to be a part of.
Well, let me give you a different perspective on that, and then it gives you a chance to kind of push back on me and kind of, because I've shifted in kind of how I view the church, because I did start out, as I said, very much rooting my assessment of it from that objective truth claim perspective, and in my opinion, there were enough things that impeached Joseph Smith's claim to authority for me that I discarded holding him up as a prophet.
And just to get clarification regarding his claims to be the equivalent of a Peter, you rejected that he was someone that could qualify for being I guess I'm asking, against what standard were you judging him? A utopian standard of he has to be perfect, or against the standard of does this man lead us to Jesus Christ? Because it sounds like what was really going on was that deeper down you had rejected Jesus and all the rest of that, and that now you were saying, well, is this man credible by a purely sort of secular standard?
Okay,
because I think those are just different questions.
That is an uncharitable addition to what I've said, because when I went through this process, I wasn't actually analyzing the claims of Christianity. I was only analyzing the claims of Joseph Smith, and growing up in the primary program as I did, they didn't focus a whole lot on that Joseph Smith carried the same keys as Peter in the old church. It was just Joseph Smith held the priesthood, and the priesthood is authority from God, and it came with the laying on of hands in the 1800s, and that's where the thing went, and that was really the focus of it. And so the claims that were meaningful to me included claims around the translation, anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, not anachronisms of things like horses, but textual dependencies that betrayed the chronology of it. Mm-hmm. And that was one dimension of it. Another dimension of it that was very, very important was really the study of polygamy and looking at how it operated, particularly after studying religious sexual predators in other domains, and then seeing the mechanisms of persuasion and manipulation that they used, and then going back and seeing if the use of the name of God, the use of religious persuasion, and the targeting and exploiting the vulnerability of pious people that you saw in these other traditions, I found them in Joseph Smith as well. And that kind of allowed me then to say, well, hold on, what are these other claims? And there were just other things that more and more didn't add up. But at the same time, the more you study, the more you respect that this was a remarkable figure in history who had remarkable charisma. He had an organizational genius that I think there are rare figures in history that could do it. And so it's a mixed bag for him. But on the question of, is he in fact the mouthpiece of God, were his claims, I mean, there's even like internal contradictory things. The sermon in the Grove and the King Follett sermon to me were more religious experimenting, but they were done with the same claim of authority that, I mean, he kind of drew the line and said that, if people can't describe to you the character of God, they may as well sit down and be just like any other religious preacher. And then he proceeded to give a character of God that even today people kind of like, well, I don't know that we actually believe this. And so there were just internal contradictions that were part of that. And I don't want to gish gallop you here, but what I want to do is move from that, because it's very easy at that point to say, well, Mormonism's a cult just like any other cult, and now we just have to tear it down because it's destroying and hurting people. And I think that mode of thinking is a motivation you'll find in a lot of people early on, especially in their angry phase. And then there's the chapter of, okay, well, I've discarded this moral paradigm, and now I've got to figure out what's right, because a lot of the stuff that the church told me was wrong, well, there's nothing that wrong about it anyway, and I need to go and experiment and figure out things for myself. And thankfully, I didn't have much of that. Because I think I encountered that debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, and that's where they really talked about the different forms of truth. And Sam Harris was very focused on the objective reality claims of truth, and Jordan Peterson was very much on, hold on a second, there's notions of truth that operate in the realm of truths that are actually important for human survival and for human existence, and you cannot disregard those things. And there's, I think it's actually two different debates. I mean, you could still have the debate about objective truth, and
Yeah.
there would be a pretty good victory on one side, in my opinion, and there would also be the debate about truths that drive the human experience, that are ways to shape your life, that are good for an individual, a family, and a society, that will come out in the other thing. And I think understanding those two realms of truth claims was one brick in my new worldview. The other one was listening to other religious traditions and realizing that the conception of a top-down authoritarian concrete religion that I had as a church member, where I believed that all other religions must also adopt the same thing. They must also claim authority and know for certain many different things.
They all think they're the
I
true
started
church.
to listen to them and realize that some of those aspects of scripture, like looking through a glass darkly, a lot of those things were giving birth to a new framework, a new conception of religion and of Christianity, which was one that had a more ecumenical perspective, that did not try to draw lines that divided the Christian body and isolate some and point fingers at some. Certainly there have to be boundaries when things go crazy, but there was a form of understanding that people found different expressions of Christ in their life, and there were some principles that held and bound them together, but there was way more flexibility. And on top of that, the leaders themselves did not claim to speak as the mouthpiece of God. They claimed that, like, the concept of a bishop or an authority figure was very different from the concept of a pastor or someone who was a friend who would walk with you in a spiritual walk. And so I didn't join any of these groups, but I understood that not everybody out there is in the literalistic view of a concrete religion with concrete claims. And then I think encountering the world of secular Judaism and the idea that there's a cultural component of religious traditions, that people can find value and meaning and purpose in them without even exploring or caring about the truth claims, which could implode the entire thing. And I think understanding that religion is more than just what Mormonism taught it to me. And then I think the thing that really kind of sealed it all together for me was listening to and seeing the way that evolutionary psychologists would talk about religion and the human mind and the way that societies have evolved, and the way that they look at the history of religions and the history of societies started to make me see religion as more of it's a bundle of claims that have validity, not because of their objective truth. And I should say a bundle of claims and a bundle of values. And for me, it's the values are more important than the claims. And that the values themselves exist and were able to be replicated through multiple generations because they served a positive vector in an individual's prosperity, stability in their life, cohesion of a family unit that could foster the next generation and replicate itself in the next generation. Like all those different things, you can find some crazy atheist secular worldviews that may root themselves only in objectable, provable claims and not believe anything else, but that doesn't give them the stability, the longevity, the passing to the next generation that a different set of values could. Now, I think these values are good because of the values themselves. They are inherently good because they convey to the individual and to the family unit and to the society things that benefit them in terms of stability and longevity and intergenerational passing of these things. And so religion then becomes a vehicle for conveying values through a society, and those values then impart positive benefits onto the holders of those religions because of the nature of those values themselves. And it's independent of the truth claim. So you can see how some values may have different, like if you compare Jehovah's Witnesses to Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses they specifically diminish the importance of higher education because they're supposed to spend more time in the religious paradigm than in the pursuit of knowledge. Well, that puts a very upper limit on the average income and the average educational level of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so those are values that are rooted in truth claims, because the people who gave them those values claimed that Jehovah gave them the authority to do that. But it confined the positive effects of them, which is very different from Mormonism, which places a tremendous emphasis on, not only education, but sacrifice, hard work, a cohesive family unit. All of those things are values that may be justified and may have a stronger propagation through the system because they're justified in a divine claim that then people who take a pious perspective and a religious perspective are more likely to incorporate and not pick apart like the deconstructionists are more likely to do. But those values then impart certain aspects to the people who hold them. And I think that like the $100 billion or whatever that the church has, it's a measure in some instance of the effectiveness of that constellation of values that has become encoded in the culture of the church, bound together by its religious claims and its authority paradigm. So anyway, so this is just a long way of me saying that the question of the truth claims is very different for me from the question of the values. And I think what's been important to me is making sure that I can see the value of the good things that Mormonism endowed my life with, and making sure I don't discard those, and that I find some way to impart them to my kids, because I can't believe in Joseph Smith anymore. That's a toothpaste thing that you just can't cram back in. I can believe in him as an organizer, but I also cannot unsee the religious predation that he has. And I can't unsee some of the Book of Mormon stuff. But at any rate, I can still find good things in the Book of Mormon. I can find values that have been conveyed through the Book of Mormon that are pretty good, that I still have. And the same thing with the Bible. I can find crappy stuff in the Bible, but I can also find the good things. And when you look at the history of religious traditions, it is those good, positive stories that have the effect of increasing an individual's positive life values and experience that get conveyed. That those are the stories that get told. The stories about the, go get a bunch of sex slaves from that nation over there. That story doesn't get told. But the story about, how we deal with someone who has betrayed us and how we can extend grace and forgiveness to those who have done us wrong, those stories get told because those are the stories that actually have the ability to bring a society together, to make them cohesive. And as soon as somebody lets go of those values and takes their life out of that matrix of values and goes off and explores something else, they are in unexplored territory that does not have the evolutionary benefit of a bundle of values that has already stood the test of time because it's around here 100, 200, 300, a century, 1,000 years later from when it was formed, and continues to evolve. And so I think looking at religion more as an evolutionary bundle of values that do impart undeniable benefits to its members makes a question of epistemology almost unnecessary. But
and you're saying, when you say epistemology, you mean,
go ahead.
When you say epistemology, you're talking about, in this case, about sort of the objective, rational side of it,
right?
In exploring those truth claims, not epistemology more broadly, as I'm framing it, as a exploration of all levels of truth that exist.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know many people that would necessarily use the word epistemology for that type of exploration that you're having, because it deals too much in the human realm of beliefs, values, ethics, and morality. Maybe it would be,
if you're a believer in moral truth, you know what I mean? Like, you're talking about this desire for human thriving and flourishing and all that kind of stuff. There's sort of a moral presupposition that you're bringing to the table there, that ultimately you're making like a moral truth claim. You're making the claim that life is worth continuing, that, humanity is worth continuing. That is a good, right? And so I have to point out that when you do that, you're basically making a moral truth claim when you say
I don't know that I would call it. Well, this is what I was talking about earlier, where people are using the word truth in two different realms, and that's not like, I think there can be a different word.
And that's fine. I would say, you're describing.
I like the word value. I think value gives honor both to the subjective nature of it and how it motivates an individual.
But a value is a truth claim. It's to claim that X is valuable. It's to say that, that this thing is valuable regardless of your opinion of it. Like racism is bad and it's wrong to hold racist values. And that's to state something about the world, the reality that exists within human interactions and psychology. But anyway, this is potentially getting off on an entirely different.
Well, no, I can understand your opinion on that. I don't share the opinion on that. But these are semantics about what word that you use to describe something that we could agree on, because I think, values are subjective. There's a range of different values. There is something that does kind of root all of our experience as humans, which is an aversion to pain, for example. And there are some things that are tied to our evolution. There are evolutionary manifestations of certain values that an organism and that exists in a society for which certain values are prioritized will thrive, whereas those for which they are not will diminish. And so that pressure then allows certain values to be conveyed forward. And so I think that's an important element of it. But that's different from an objective truth. Like there can be truths that are understanding how human psychology works. Like if, for all things being equal, the price of an object will increase if the supply stays the same, but the demand increases. Like those things, they're different. It's a different realm of quote unquote truth, but it deals more with value.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, if there is any such thing as truth outside of the scientific, then truth claims can be made about those things. And that it's,
well, I'm just suggesting
I just feel like we're 2 hours into this and it's like, this is a conversation on using the word entirely on its own.
Right. Insisting on the word truth there is something that we don't have an agreement on. I think that that is it changes, I guess, the nature of the calculus that you would go in that direction. But that can be a side point because you're right. We are 2 hours into this and we do want to draw it to a close.
Last time what did we do last time? Wasn't it like 5 hours?
It's only 6 hours. Come on. Okay, so anyway, so I just wanted to lay that out with me. And it sounds like your pushback on me for a little bit would be, well, what I'm calling values is itself a form of truth claim that you would then apply your 5-witness model to, and that 5-witness model would actually point to the truthfulness of the church. I'm using reasons that don't necessarily.
Let me resist that a little bit. Okay. The church isn't even relevant in this conversation that we're talking at right now, because we've gone from the level 3 conversation, which is the church, which is a conversation about Christianity. We now, when you're talking about the nature of agency and truth, you are at the bottom of the level 1 conversation, right? You are, and which is, by the way, it's really interesting conversation. And that's where people end up. That's where the divergences happen a lot of the time, are in the fundamentals, right? And so that's one of the reasons that I always tell people, like, that's where we have to go if we want to try and start to at least not resolve our differences, but to understand where they're coming from. Because depending on the way that people conceptualize even things like reality and truth and how we know truth, these deeper, what I call level 1 conversations, like, I don't want to, like, why am I going to sit there and talk about like keys of Peter when it's like, you guys, this isn't part of this. These are way different things. You have to go through. It's like, it's a difference between a discussion about calculus and a discussion about arithmetic. If we can't agree that 2 + 2 equals 4, then we can't move on to the next things.
Let me tell you a little bit about why I don't really like the paradigm that you have, where you can't even talk to someone about religious claim A if you haven't already had the conversation of lower religious claims. And that is just that if I acknowledge that there's something healthy and positive affirming about how religion has helped convey values that are positive for society forward, and even saying, there's something unique about the Judeo-Christian tradition, which has been tied to our evolution in understanding concepts of liberal science and moral and ethical principles that have structured a society that is freer than anything the world has seen before. Like, all of those things, I think, are important. And if you go to people who, for example, are following Warren Jeffs, and then you say, okay, hold on, before we get to Warren Jeffs, we got to talk about, the God and the Christian thing. There's going to be some people where you will deconstruct them all the way down to atheism when you deconstruct Warren Jeffs.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if I take the position that there's some good in religion and there's some positive aspects in religion, and there can be a way to soften the harder edges of it and return some of that. And I know you're not a fan of this so much, but that autonomy and agency internally.
You're saying that there's moral truth in the FLDS. There are moral truths in the FLDS church that we shouldn't abandon. And I would agree. I think that in any religious tradition, or in almost any tradition, you can find truths. But the thing is that, again, it takes you back to the level 1 conversation. The only reason you, Jonathan, are valuing these truths or these things in the FLDS church is because of the current context that you're in. If you were in Roman society or you were in Aztec society, you wouldn't see the things as valuable that you are valuing now. And so there becomes a question of, well, is Incan society's values, is there some standard by which we can say that our values are actually superior to those of the Incans or the Romans or the Mongols or the Vikings or the Polynesians? And so you are bringing to the table something, is my perspective on it, to want to hold on to these moral truths because you believe in moral truth. And I applaud you for that. That's an area of the level 1 conversation that you and I would agree on. Bill Reel might not.
Well, I think part of returning to these values in the church and looking at them a different way, and not just in Mormonism, but in religious traditions in general, is, I think, seeing the paths that people go down when they abandon them. And so there's a couple of, I guess the thing to get here, though, is I was not finding nor looking for positive things in the FLDS tradition, because that's kind of my example of when religious authority goes so far that even you and I can agree that there's a problem there. And so then, if we start with the idea that, well, as long as you've got, your 5 witness model, how does your 5 witness model interrogate the claims of the FLDS? Like, if we want to move to that section there.
Yeah, I would. So first of all, the FLDS claims exist within the level of which church is true. Again, do I have good reasons to believe that Warren Jeffs and this and that group actually hold to the that they're actually prophets of Jesus Christ? You could even go within Mormonism, like that. Okay, Joseph Smith was indeed a prophet. Do these guys, are they the true kind of inheritors of his
Prophetic mantle or
prophetic
authority.
mantle? Yeah. And they actually hold the keys of the kingdom. That's the question that I'm asking specifically. When you ask, is it true? It's like, I want to get specific. What do you mean, is it true? The truth claim I'm evaluating is if these guys hold the keys that Joseph Smith held. And I think for doctrinal reasons, for things that Joseph Smith said, for things in Jacob 2, and other things that we hold, there are good reasons from a Latter-day Saint level of conversation to say that this group does not, and that they are actually in apostasy.
Okay. So if you applied that same level of analysis to Joseph Smith's claim from the perspective of those who preceded him, would you come to a different conclusion? Like, because it seems to me like that's what a lot of the Christians in Joseph Smith's world would have done, is they would have examined Joseph Smith's claim based on their understanding of what constituted a prophet or a leader or a holder of religious authority. And then they would have perhaps come to the same conclusion, but they would have, not gone to the ground level of epistemology. They would have been just relying on the tools that they had available.
They would have been at the Christian level of conversation, the level, what I call the level 2 conversation. You're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ in the Bible, and now you are seeking like his true church, right? And that was the thing. Everyone's like, Joseph Smith is not in accordance with the Bible. That was, and that is to this day, the primary criticism that the Christians bring to the church. And so the questions that we're asking are just different. And so when I ask as a Christian, primarily, is Joseph Smith a prophet of the Lord Jesus Christ? I think that there's a compelling case to be made, one that I actually believe, that says that he is. But approaching that conversation, I'm approaching it assuming Christ was who he said he was, that they're known by their fruits, that, they're not, that prophets are fallible. There's all sorts of things that I'm bringing to this, that God can speak to me and that God can actually tell me what's true. And so you'll say, somebody, you maybe or others will look and be like, yeah, but none of that stuff's true. And I'm like, exactly. Our difference is actually further down. And so if we want to have a real conversation instead of just a debate, then what we need to do is that we need to go down to the presuppositional level to figure out where do we actually agree, then stand side by side, look forward and say, okay, where are we diverging here? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing at this basic level of epistemology? Or why don't you believe in God even? And that's where I find that you actually have interesting, productive conversations instead of, it's kind of like, if I can't even get someone to agree, if we can't even agree that rationality like matters, that logic is going to govern what we're talking about, then it's pointless to even have the conversation.
Yeah, and I hope I haven't made that argument in
no, you haven't.
Context of this discussion.
And I'm not here. And just so you know, and I have heard people critique me for this. If somebody wants to go after Mormonism specifically, and they're willing to grant the Christian premises for the sake of argument, I'm not saying I won't talk to people about it. I'm just saying that the arguments
there's one set of Christian premises.
No, there's a bunch. That's the other thing. But if you come to
I'm pretty sure they're all competing. Mormonism told me that.
Well, what I'm saying though is that I'm talking about mere Christianity. Like, we all believe that the Bible is reliable to knowing the mind and will of God, right? Like, I'm pretty sure Christians in general believe that. See, what I'm saying is that the reasons that I give won't register with you in any way unless you accept these. Like, if I say God manifested the truth to me by the power of the Holy Spirit, you can say, well, there's no such thing as the Holy Spirit. So it's like, you're right. It doesn't register. But if you believe in the Holy Spirit, then it's actually a plausible claim.
So from an outsider's view, looking at your epistemological paradigm, what I believe you've done is you've smuggled in a whole bunch of assumptions and shielded them from analysis so that you can continue a belief in claims that would not otherwise be justified. On top of that, no. Okay, this is the thing. I'm going to lay something down here, but you're going to see why. Okay, so this smuggling in of these things allows a subversion of epistemology, which allows you to maintain a belief in something that would not otherwise be justified based on the objective reality notion of epistemology, not based on this other concept that you have. And the reason that I see that as a problem is because it's exploitable. You could take somebody, for example, Warren Jeffs or somebody else, and they could take that exact same paradigm and they just shift who it is that gets to be the authority. They get to shift what it means to follow Christ by their rhetoric. And it allows the same epistemology to exist because this authority thing exists in there. Now, the reason carrying over these premises and assumptions into your assessment of the truth of it is something that I encountered recently, because if you follow my channel, I've actually done a lot of stuff about transgenderism, and specifically around the claim that gender affirming care is going to help children who experience gender dysphoria. And one of the critical arguments there is that we're trying to keep our understanding of how medical intervention applies to this population in as purely objective scientific terms as possible. We're trying to apply the rules of evidence-based medicine to this therapy as applied to the patient population. And the way the medical community, the best tool set that it has to do that with right now is something called the grade criteria, where they look at all the different studies that have asked this question, and they try to give every study and every question addressed in those studies a level of evidence that's rated as strong, or very low, moderate or high quality evidence. And that evidence, another word for that is confidence that the intervention actually has the effect for which it has. And then there's, in addition to that, and that's an algorithm. It's like how big is the study? How many people? Was it randomized or was it retrospective? There's a set of criteria for it. And there's kind of a little formula for if you have so many studies of this sort of thing, then you can give a strong recommendation, and we have high confidence that the intervention will act. And if you don't, then you have low. But if you allow premises to color your interpretation and you deviate from it, to the extent that you deviate in it, you are betraying the principle of evidence-based medicine, and you're allowing biases to be smuggled in there. And the people who set up this grade criteria specifically say, do not deviate from this protocol if you're going to create a scientific review. But that when you look at WPATH, the literature that set the protocols for gender-affirming care for the hormones and surgery, they specifically say we are using a modified grade criteria, and they don't tell you the different values that they use to try to change what should be, by all admission, a low quality, low confidence that the intervention actually has the effect it has. But it's because they betrayed those principles and smuggled in what is ultimately going to be a distortion. And that's the thing that I have a concern when, first time I encountered your authority paradigm, or your 5-witness paradigm, I understand from a broader, almost postmodern perspective why you included authority in there. But I see it as a weakness in your epistemology that will lend itself to smuggling and betraying the whole project from the beginning, because it allows people then to use claims of authority to subvert how you interpret everything else.
Okay.
And that's my statement on that.
So essentially, just to kind of steelman that a little bit, you're saying that that authority, and I guess I got to kind of clarify before I can steelman, you're saying that authority doesn't belong as one of the epistemological tools that we use to validate if something is true or not?
Right. No special authority. Somebody should be able to replicate an experiment and come to a conclusion or test a finding, even if they don't have a degree, even if they don't have anything. And again, this is in the realm of scientific claims.
Yeah. So you're saying that there should not be any unquestionable authority. Like there should always be a check, is what you're saying, on authority. If you have authority out there,
you should be able to question something
that can't be shown, like, hey, you're a flawed authority, that shouldn't exist. Is that correct?
If you're a flawed authority, so authority is not part of what validates a claim.
Ever.
Well, I think that's the goal.
So, like,
and to the extent that you can say, hold on a second.
The vaccine, for instance, the authorities were on the side that this was safe and could be used and all that. And that's a real hot button topic. But let's just say that there are people that were questioning that authority. Now, you were telling people, and others, I actually don't know if you were, but people were saying, no, you should listen to what the scientists are saying about this.
That is a sentiment that is out there, and I consider that an unscientific sentiment.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, I agree. But we use authority for all sorts of things. Like, we base what we do on things authorities say all the time.
That's different from the authority playing a role in the epistemology.
Well, I think it does play a role in the epistemology to say that something, if it is witness testimony of something. For instance, does it increase your confidence that something is true if you're in a courtroom and they literally file in the 100 people that were at this accident. All of them walk in. These are all people who are, randomly chosen, so they don't have any bias or whatever. They just happen to be there. And they all say the car ran the red light, 100 of them. Does that contribute to saying that you have justified reason to believe that the person ran the red light?
It's not a scientific claim, and the witness testimony is not 100%. So I think you can get to a confidence. You can get to a confidence level, but in terms of, you could have 100 people give you that testimony, and then you show a video that shows that those 100 people were mistaken, and the weight of that video will outweigh the testimony.
Agreed. And that's what my model says. My model says that authority as a tool of epistemology grants confidence. But here's the other thing. You get that video that came in, well, then they show evidence that video was actually doctored and what you were seeing in the video, it was actually AI that created the video. And so your eye, like, what are you going to believe? Your eyes from that video, or you're going to believe the witnesses? My point is just this. The point is that no witness is infallible. And so what we're left with is a system by which we utilize these witnesses, depending on the situation, to triangulate the truth as best that we can. And what I'm saying is that authority is a
postmodern argument that's trying to blow up the idea that anything is reliable at all. And so then that allows people to assert things.
I reject postmodernism. Postmodernism claims that it's because it's all subjective, therefore it's like we can't trust anything and it's all equal. But
the thing is, like, when I said that there's a video that shows it, there's an assumption there, and the assumption there is that the video is depicting what happened in the real world. And so you're putting that video in the category of authority. Other people would say that's actually in the category of sense data, of objective data that doesn't have
the sense data you get is there, but it isn't. You are actually physically there, seeing the actual.
I understand that, but you're seeing what is a record of the events. That is, and again, this is a hypothetical.
That's being provided by an authority.
This is a hypothetical, so we are assuming that the video is depicting what actually took place.
Okay.
Now, if you want to step back and say, well, we could be brains in a vat, then that's where you get back into that radical skepticism thing. And the thing is that is a tool that has been used by people to try to smuggle in claims, because then, who's to say?
But my epistemology rejects that, because what my epistemology does is it says that we can utilize these tools to establish levels of plausibility. Right? Like, for instance, that angel that appeared in your room, like, it is plausible that you were just hallucinating, right? And it's also plausible that, but the way you establish the plausibility of any given claim or any given experience that you have is based on different things. I'm not a radical skeptic. I don't believe that it's all like, all claims are equal because it's all subjective, postmodern, blah, blah, blah.
Well, that's good.
That's insane.
There's been a few posts that you've made that I'm like, oh, hold on, this sounds like a postmodern thing. It blows apart the reliability of something.
Because remember, the logic that you're talking about is all part of it's baked into the system, right? And so I should go with the least. I should go with the. For instance, logic would say that I should go with the idea that is the least conjecture ridden. Right. So, like, if there's in the other room,
I mean, I've heard people say that.
There
may be a case where some complex thing happens that's hard to explain.
You're right, but it would not be plausible it's more, you're going to go with what is most likely true. Okay. That's what we have to do. That we have to go with what's most likely true based on the witnesses that are available to us. If you have nothing else to go on, but the fact that 100 people came in the room and told you that this person ran the red light, then the information that you have, the most plausible argument to go with is that, even though you could be wrong, because I don't believe in a perfect epistemic certainty through rationality, that the best you can do is say that the best explanation for these events is that the person ran the red light, based on the fact that all of these witnesses said so. Right. And so my epistemological model exists.
I guess the issue though is right. I don't know. RFM does this occasionally too, and they talk about the courtroom and the evidence in the courtroom. I guess it's Randy Bell who does this more than anything else. And I'm just like, courtrooms are not epistemological prospects, and so it's just.
I think, and maybe this is just to understand our disagreement rather than to try and resolve it. I think we are dealing with fundamentally different views of what epistemology is. I'm talking about epistemology as a theory of knowledge that is not confined just to the objective scientific. I believe that epistemology it's asking the question.
Okay, no, this is good because, yeah, and that to me, because you don't allow contradiction of objective sense data and reason to trump it, because you've expanded to allow authority and outcomes to justify that which would otherwise be impeached, then you're not really talking about epistemology. You're just talking about a way of giving points to something that you like because you perceive its outcomes in a way that is favorable, that has a degree of subjectivity that somebody who is a Jehovah's Witness would run a similar value assessment.
I don't. I think we're going off into kind of a straw man here, just to understand the difference. Okay, I incorporate the objective scientific claims to establish the validity of certain truth. But I also recognize that science itself is based on authority, largely, because many of the scientific claims that you believe and that we all believe, we didn't do the experiments. You know what I mean? Like, we didn't verify these things and do it. We are trusting in what people have told us. In fact, if you went and saw,
the idea though is that you could, like, if you without a degree had the tools to go do it, you could, and
yes,
you could even disprove something that is scientifically, like, it's open to you. And if you did the experiment, and this is, hello falsification crisis or replication crisis. Yep. If you did the experiment, you might actually show that some of the confidence that we have in some things is not justified. But that is engaging then in epistemology, which betrays authority.
I do think that authorities are subject to science in the sense that I believe that if somebody makes a claim as an authority about the physical world, which is what the scientific enterprise deals with, and then the science shows, and I don't mean the science trademark, I mean the actual experiments that, like, you did demonstrate that this is false, you go with that. But what's really crazy, here's where you get really wild. Remember, Jonathan, you could probably be convinced that the angel that appeared to you in your room and that really was a real angel was a hallucination based on the authority of the scientific establishment saying that, hey, your brain can do these different things, and the authorities could actually get you to disbelieve what you saw with your own eyes. And so and whether that's right or wrong. I have an interesting
perspective because I have a close friend who was a follower of Denver Snuffer, and he claimed to have the same experience of the second witness that Denver Snuffer promotes. And so he claimed to have a one-on-one, in-person interface with Christ. And as he's gotten further from that movement, because he's seen that movement follow a lot of the pathways of religious movements that are unstructured and chaotic, that go down things, he's had to revisit his own experience, and he sees it a little bit differently now. I have another friend who also had an experience with a divine visitation, and has had to kind of go through that same process where they realize now, and now I believe they are atheist ex-Mormons, but they believe that experience that they have was a human psychological phenomenon born out of intense, they were just focusing every aspect of their life on this question, and it became a very powerful psychological force. And that's how they believe it. But both of them, as they describe their religious paradigms, the God that visited them had different conceptions of what it is that visit meant, which God it was that visited it. They were just different God worldviews. One was a Snufferite type thing, and the other was not.
That's why I say the actual, even sense data, because if we're kind of boiling it down, that like sense data itself is the fundamental thing, I actually disagree. because sense data, the problem with sense data is that it also can be manipulated. I would say that what is the raw floor, and I argue about this, and this is where I get really into the limits of where I'm going with my epistemological model, because I've asked the question sort of, is there something that's even more fundamental than all of these that is sort of the root of what it means to know something at all, right? It isn't just because you heard it from someone else that you know it. It isn't that you, and foundationalist epistemology, if you study what that is, most foundationalist epistemology, which I consider myself a foundationalist, say that at the root of knowledge is actually experience. That the actual experience, the what it was like to be there, the consciousness, like experience of reality is the ground floor, not how you interpret that experience, but the raw experience itself.
How do you separate your experience from how you interpret the experience?
It's almost impossible to do because
because it would seem like there has to be a triangulation from an outside perspective. So like,
yes,
the beauty of like scientific inquiry and this idea that we have a coherent world that exists, so that if two people come up with experiments that overlap and come to the same conclusion, that, and especially if it's from different schools of thought, like that whole God Sad thing, the I forget the name of it, but that's a way of establishing things. But that is like, because I don't consider like eyewitness testimony and personal experience, that's in the realm of subjectivity, and like everything that has to do with a single human and their interpretation of data and everything, all of that is inherently biased. And like the whole point of going through the exercise of epistemology is try to get away from those human those human aspects of it to just cut through the bias that is inherent to that.
Agreed.
Acknowledging that it's hard to do. Now, I know you said that we have 10 minutes left. Are we on that? Shoot. I don't want to make you.
Oh, yeah, it is. I can go for a few more. I can hear my wife actually getting home upstairs. So
I have the same.
All I'm going to say, I would just, if you watch my video on it, I talk about it, but, and I have a very hard time even articulating it, but it's the basic idea of what we say about our experience is different than what the actual experience was, right? When I use language to convey to you something that happened to me, I'm trying to paint a picture for you of what I experienced. Now, I could paint a picture that isn't accurate to what the actual experience was, or portrays this experience in a way that it wasn't what it was, or misconstrues it in your mind when you're creating the mental picture. But what about the raw experience that I had that I'm trying to articulate? Like something happened, right? I think this gets down to the level of like, I think, therefore I am. Like,
well, I
don't know. I mean, actual existence is the level.
The way that I interpret that is, we have experiences. We can only interpret them through what we conceive of our experiences as, and our experiences are subjective. They're inherently subjective. And things like optical illusions are a very tangible way to see this, where we may experience something that doesn't actually comport with reality, but it aligns with our perception of reality. And there was, I think, one of the things that you mentioned earlier in this discussion, and was part of what led us to have this discussion, was accusing me of being a positivist, and then saying that Karl Popper's principle of falsification was a problem. And I'm just like, what does all this mean? Because I'm not like a school of philosophers. And I guess it's my understanding, after I'm like, okay, Jacob's causing me being a positivist, now I have to go read about positivism. But that was like a philosophical movement where people believe that the only claims that we can consider to be real are ones for which there is positive evidence of those claims. And everything else, including all the moral questions of the world, are irrelevant. There is no morality. All those things are just dust in the wind. The only things that are real are things for which there's positive claims.
I wouldn't say positive claims. What I would say is that they are in principle, as you talked about earlier, that they're in principle verifiable. That and then Popper switched it and he said falsifiable, which is, in my mind, I don't know that there's a real deep distinction there, but the idea is
that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of the thing, because I think the Karl Popper principle and falsifiability, it's really powerful, because it's essentially it's like the black swan. Like you can think something and think something, but as soon as you come up with something that shows that your hypothesis was wrong, that's actually way more powerful, because if you bring a data point that says your hypothesis is right, there's probably a bunch of other things that could encompass all of that, but something that proves that it's wrong has a lot more power. And so on top of that, a question, and then the second part of Popper's position, as I understand it, is that this really just applies to scientific, objective scientific claims. It doesn't apply to morality and ethics, and you can have arguments and debates about morality and ethics, but those are different, because the other dimension of falsifiability is if you are making a claim for which there can be no test to potentially falsify it, then your claim is not falsifiable. And so it's an assertion, but it's not a scientific claim. You might consider it an opinion, but it's not something for which there's
Okay,
that
so
you should
here's-
hold a
so
great
let
deal
me-
of weight about it.
So is the statement that X must be scientific, or I'm sorry, is it, because this is the problem with the falsifiability argument that has been pointed out forever by philosophers, it's just to say that something is scientific or it isn't, because it doesn't say that it isn't meaningful or necessary or true. Because
Right.
if you say that the only truths are scientific truths, or the only truths are those which can be falsified, that those are the only ones that matter, is that a falsifiable statement? It's not. The actual argument, and this is why logical positivism, which said the only meaningful statements are statements which are in principle verifiable, otherwise they're just gobbledygook.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that that statement itself is not falsifiable or verifiable. And so what it does is it shows that I'm not disagreeing that, yes, I believe that Popper is right, that for a claim to be scientific, it must be a falsifiable claim, at least in principle, or verifiable in principle. However, I go, so what? I don't believe that scientific truth is all that exists. It's just talking about a particular realm of truth that you're right. If you're not talking about something that is in the realm of that which we have access to through science. But there are all sorts of other ways to know
this points to a thing, like the fact that you will not separate truth, the word truth, from the objective reality realm, from the human moral value realm, it keeps having this conflation, and it feels like it's something that you have to hold on to because it allows you to smuggle in holding on to the truth.
No, I would say that because that's the world I actually live in. I don't live.
Well, I understand that, but
of,
all the people who have
of,
smuggled all these other things in epistemologically will say that they live in that world. That's the belief system they inhabit.
You're right, but even within, but I believe that there's truth within that other realm. Let's call it truth 2.0 and truth 1.0, right? These are different parts of a reality. I think they're both part of the same great whole that is the reality that we inhabit.
But it's like the difference between poetry and math. Like one of them deals in a completely different realm, and there's a different set of rules for which you establish the truth of it, quote unquote truth of it, than in math. And that's a whole conversation in of itself when you start to talk about if there is such a thing as truth 2.0, not just arbitrariness 2.0, right? Because to claim that there is something that is a morally true statement, like racism is wrong, that exists within the realm of truth 2.0. And if it isn't actually true, well then, yeah, it's just an arbitrary statement. That's the postmodernist claim. The postmodernist claim is that the entire realm of human language and value is ultimately just arbitrary. And arbitrary. You were sounding a little bit like Derrida a little bit earlier when you were talking about using language to convey your experience. I'm like, I thought you weren't postmodern.
But the
thing is, there's other ways to view it other than moral subjectivity.
This realm, real quick, the realm of values and morality and human existence and consciousness and all of that, I believe is governed as much by law as the realm of science. And to say that it's not governed by law
is to be
a postmodernist.
Is that a premise that you bring to the assessment?
No, I would say it's an observation of the way reality actually works. I think that things like human suffering and consciousness actually exist, and that our experience with suffering is real. In fact, I would say that it's more real than this table that's in front of me, because I can doubt that this table in front of me exists and that my eyes are playing tricks on me. But when I'm suffering, there's nothing more immediate to my consciousness than the existence of that suffering. And that suffering
Whatever you
is
do,
governed by law.
don't look up sadomasochism, because you might be surprised about the whole subjective nature of suffering. All right, well, we better wrap it up. Okay, this has been instructive. I was hoping that you guys could articulate an epistemology that would appeal to people on the outside, or could find some way to do it. And if I put myself in the realm of the viewer, it's really hard, I have to admit.
Yeah, and just this is my final word on this.
It's so obvious to the outsider that you are smuggling in assumptions that are rooted in your religious view of Joseph Smith and the church, that if you say, okay, if somebody else in Scientology or anyone else, if they just smuggle in their assumptions about their religious paradigm, they're going to come to the same conclusion, but it's going to keep them there. And I know you don't want to do that, and that's not what you're trying to do. It's just, as an honest assessment from an outsider, that's what it looks like. Well, as much as you would see an L. Ron Hubbard devotee, and
my final statement is that when you boil it down, if I'm trying to understand our disagreement, not trying to resolve it, but I think the nature of our disagreement comes down to the deepest level of what we believe the nature of reality is and what governs that reality. That I think is where our difference is. And we could debate that, but I think that's where the distinction comes, is just we have very different views about the nature of reality and the ability for us to know the nature of that reality. That's the way I would frame it. To sum it up,
if I take your, for me. Okay, you got to go. All right, fine. Well, it's been fun, and until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Take care.